Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I had no idea what was lurking in my apartment until one strange night forced me to confront the possibility that I wasn't living alone. I'm a 35-year-old guy who works full-time. I come home late, leave early, and rarely talk to my roommate because our schedules never match up. When I first noticed the odd noises in the hallway, I brushed it off. I told myself it was the old pipes or the creaking wooden floor. But things got weirder, and soon I started realizing that there might be someone else living with me, someone I never saw. That's when my nights became restless, and my days were filled with an unsettling awareness that, at any moment, I could turn a corner and find a stranger in my own home. I moved into this old apartment building in the downtown area a few months ago. The place has tall ceilings, narrow hallways, and heavy wooden doors that look like they've been there since the 1950s. There's an elevator that rattles whenever I use it, so I prefer the stairs. The stairs squeak too, but they feel safer. My unit is on the 4th floor, near the end of a hallway that is usually quiet after 8 at night. The paint is peeling in some parts of the corridor, and the walls are kind of discolored, which makes everything look gloomy, especially under the dim lights. I share the apartment with a guy named Marcos. He's in his early 40s, works a lot, and travels often. We talk once or twice a week, usually just long enough to discuss rent or who's buying paper towels. I don't know much about him, and he doesn't seem to want to know much about me. That was fine by me at first, because I also keep to myself. I spend most of my time either at work or out with friends. When I'm home, I watch TV, play on my phone, or read. But one night, maybe 3 weeks after moving in, I experienced something that I can't get out of my head. It was around 11 p.m. On a Friday. I was sitting on the couch in our small living room, scrolling through social media on my phone. The hallway leads from the living room to the bedrooms and bathroom. The living room lights were on, but the hallway was dark. I could see just a sliver of the hallway from where I sat, and everything looked normal. I heard footsteps. They sounded like soft, slow steps on the wooden floor, coming from the direction of my bedroom. I thought Marcos had come back from his trip. He had mentioned he was traveling that week, but I couldn't remember the exact date of his return. I waited to hear his voice or see him pop out from the hallway, but the footsteps stopped right near the living room entrance, and I didn't see anyone. I stared at the hallway entrance for a few seconds, wondering if he was messing with me or trying to scare me. I called out, "Marcos?" No answer. I got up, walked to the hallway, and turned on the light. The hallway was empty and both bedroom doors were open. Marcos's door was dark inside. He wasn't there. I checked the bathroom. Empty. The apartment was silent. I started questioning whether I had really heard anything at all. Maybe I was tired, or maybe the old wood had popped or settled. But it had sounded exactly like someone walking. The floor had squeaked in that familiar pattern you hear when someone takes a few slow steps. I felt a chill, but I tried to shrug it off. The next morning I woke up and got ready for work. I locked my bedroom door behind me because I got spooked the previous night, and it made me feel safer. When I left the apartment, I made sure the front door was locked. I usually do that out of habit anyway. Work was busy, and I tried to focus on my tasks, but the thought of those footsteps stayed with me. Late in the afternoon, I got a text from Marcos saying he was still out of town and would return in a couple of days. That meant there was no chance it was him in the apartment. I got home around 7 p.m. When I walked in, I immediately noticed the living room window was cracked open. I never open that window because the latch is a little broken, and I don't like leaving windows unsecured. I walked over and closed it, feeling a slight draft. Then I saw something odd in the kitchen. One of the cabinet doors was wide open. I remembered closing all the cabinets that morning when I grabbed a coffee mug. It was such a small thing, but it made my stomach twist. I walked around the apartment, checking each room, and everything else looked normal. I told myself maybe I was in a hurry and just forgot. but I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. I made dinner, watched some TV, and tried to relax. Around 10:30 p.m., I felt a weird tension, like someone was watching me. I kept glancing at the hallway, half expecting to see a figure standing there. I turned on the lights in the hallway and left them on. I checked the front door lock twice. It was secure. Then I went to bed. I locked my bedroom door again and set my phone alarm for 6 a.m. The night was quiet at first. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up to a faint sound. It reminded me of shuffling feet. I sat up in bed, listening. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't hear anything else, so I lay back down and tried to sleep. The next day, I told my friend Lucas about what had happened. He's the kind of guy who cracks jokes about anything, so I knew he'd tease me, and he did. He said, "Man, you're probably half asleep and hearing the neighbors." He laughed it off and told me not to freak out. But I couldn't drop it. Something about the way those footsteps stopped by the living room entrance had stuck with me. It felt too deliberate. I also knew the difference between the noise from the neighbors upstairs and footsteps right in front of me. Lucas suggested I set up something to record during the night. I downloaded this motion detection app that uses the phone's microphone to record audio whenever there's a sound above a certain threshold. I placed my phone outside my bedroom on the hallway floor before I went to bed. I turned off all the lights, locked my bedroom door, and tried to sleep. My plan was to check the app in the morning. That night I had trouble falling asleep. I was tense, and every little creak in the building made me jump. I told myself I might be overreacting, but I couldn't relax. Eventually, I drifted off. When I woke up around 5 a.m., I felt relieved that I hadn't heard any sounds. I picked up my phone from the hallway. The app had recorded 3 separate audio clips. The first clip was just me walking away from the phone. The second clip was a random door creak that lasted maybe a second, but the third clip was around 15 seconds long, recorded at about 3:07 a.m. I pressed play. At first, I heard a soft rustling sound, like fabric brushing against a wall. Then I heard slow footsteps, almost like someone dragging their feet. Finally, there was a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words. It was just a low, breathy mumble. Hearing that made my skin prickle. My legs felt weak, and I had a strong urge to throw my phone across the room. I didn't, but I did hit pause and then replay it 2 more times. Each time, it sounded the same. Someone had been right outside my bedroom door in the middle of the night. I spent the next hour pacing around my bedroom, thinking about what to do. I didn't have proof that there was a break-in, because nothing was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. But I had evidence that someone was in the hallway. I decided to check the entire apartment. I looked under beds, inside closets, behind the shower curtain, even in the storage space above the hallway cabinets. Nothing. If there was someone here, they were gone now. I texted Marcos, told him I thought someone might have broken in. He didn't respond right away. I took a shower, got dressed, and went to work. The whole day, I felt on edge. I kept imagining some stranger sneaking around my home at night. After work, I stopped by a hardware store and bought new locks for my bedroom door. I also got a small doorstop alarm that would alert me if someone tried to open my bedroom door while I slept. When I got home, everything seemed normal. I installed the locks on my bedroom door and placed the doorstop alarm on the floor before going to bed. I set the motion detection app again, this time leaving the phone in the kitchen, which is closer to the main entrance. That night, I fell asleep a bit easier, knowing I had taken precautions. But around 2 a.m., I woke up again because of a creaking noise. My doorstop alarm didn't go off, so I guessed whoever was out there hadn't tried to open my bedroom door. I stayed quiet, listening. I heard a faint sound of something sliding across the living room floor. Then nothing. My heart was pounding in my ears. I wanted to open the door and check, but I was afraid. My palms were sweaty and my chest felt tight. I waited about 10 minutes. Then I mustered the courage to get up. I unlocked my bedroom door slowly, trying not to make a noise. I held my phone in my hand, ready to use the flashlight. I turned the knob and opened the door a crack. The hallway light was off, so it was pitch black. I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it around. The hallway was empty. The living room was empty. The front door was locked. I checked the kitchen. No one. But I noticed the chair at our small dining table was slightly pulled out, like someone had been sitting there. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat in my bedroom with the door locked, listening to music through headphones because I didn't want to hear any more strange noises. By morning, I felt exhausted. I checked the app. There was one recording around 2:10 a.m. It was short, only about 8 seconds. It sounded like something sliding across the floor and then a low exhale. Not exactly a sigh, but more like someone breathing out near the phone. Then it ended. Marcos finally texted me back that afternoon. He said he'd return the next day and that he'd help me look around. He sounded worried. That gave me a slight sense of relief. Maybe with another person in the apartment I'd get some answers. I tried to go about my day normally, but my mind was stuck on the possibility that someone was sneaking in. I wondered if they had a key or if they were slipping in through the fire escape. The only windows large enough to enter are in the living room and in Marcos's room, but both are usually locked. There's also a basement in the building that leads to some kind of utility tunnels, but I don't know much about that. At times I wondered if it was just in my head, but the audio recordings proved something was going on. That evening, I sat in the living room until almost midnight, just waiting. I kept all the lights on. Nothing happened. No footsteps, no whispered voices, no sliding chairs. I went to bed around 1 a.m. I slept about 3 hours before waking to the sound of the floor creaking. I sat upright immediately, feeling that rush of adrenaline in my chest. I listened. It was faint, maybe coming from the hallway. My doorstop alarm was armed. I turned on my bedside lamp. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. Then everything went quiet again. In the morning, I checked the phone. It had recorded something at around 3 a.m. That was the third time something happened close to 3 in the morning. This time I heard a single footstep, then silence. No whisper, no dragging sounds, just one clear footstep. Then the recording cut off. It was like someone knew I was recording and tried to stay quiet. Marcos arrived later that day. We searched the apartment together, tapping on the walls to see if there were any hidden spaces. We checked the plumbing access behind the bathroom. We went into every corner, every cabinet. We found no sign of another person, no sleeping bag, no stash of food, nothing. He seemed disturbed by the situation. He told me he'd stay for a couple of nights to see if he could witness it too. That night, the two of us stayed in the living room with the lights off, waiting in silence. We waited until about 2 a.m. Nothing happened. We got tired and went to bed. I locked my door and he locked his. I kept the phone in the hallway again. When I woke up, I saw only one new recording on the app, around 4 a.m. It was short, just a light thump. Marcos said he hadn't heard anything. It's been like this for a while now. I keep hearing sounds around 3 in the morning. Sometimes footsteps, sometimes quiet whispers, sometimes just a small thud in the living room or kitchen. Marcos hears it occasionally too, but we haven't caught anyone. Nothing is ever stolen, and there's no sign of forced entry. It feels like someone is living here, staying hidden. I can't sleep peacefully. Every time I open my bedroom door at night, I expect to see a figure standing there. Every small noise or shadow puts me on high alert. My heart races and my body tenses up. Now I'm thinking about moving out. This place is cheap and close to work, but I can't deal with the constant anxiety. Marcos is also uneasy, but he's less inclined to leave because he's rarely home. For me, it's become unbearable. I don't want to wake up every night to check my phone recordings and find proof that some intruder is walking around while I sleep. I don't want to feel that tightness in my chest whenever the floor squeaks. I'm still here for now, but I've started looking for another place. I don't know if we'll ever catch the extra roommate, but I do know I'm tired of feeling like prey in my own home. Until I can find a new place, I'm living on edge. I lock every door, keep a flashlight by my bed, and sleep with the covers pulled over my head, listening for the slightest noise in the dark. At this point, that's my new normal. And it's miserable. I pushed open the front door of my new house on the day I moved in and felt a chill, even though it was late spring and the temperature outside was warm. The real estate agent had told me the house was old, but sturdy. I saw the thick wooden floors, the high ceilings, and the large attic that would be perfect for my work. I'm 40 years old, single, and I needed the extra space for my home office. The price was good, and the neighborhood was quiet. I expected an easy routine here, but I found out something else was going on. I want to describe everything as clearly as possible. When I first walked through the foyer, I noticed a slight creak in the floorboards. That didn't bother me much. Many old houses have that. The living room smelled dusty. The windows were large, but the light from outside seemed weaker than usual. I didn't spend much time thinking about that on the first day. I just wanted to unpack my boxes and settle in. I worked all week. I left in the morning and came back at night. Nothing unusual happened until the third day. I got home and flipped on the hallway light. I looked up the stairs and saw a faint glow coming from the attic door at the end of the hallway on the second floor. I stood there for a moment, my shoulders tensed, and I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I remembered that I hadn't gone up to the attic since the move. I had no reason to go there yet. I shook my head, climbed the stairs slowly, and saw that the attic light was on. I stepped up to the door, turned the knob, and opened it. The attic was in front of me, half lit by a single overhead bulb. There were boxes stacked against the walls. Old furniture covered in white sheets took up a lot of space. I stared for a moment, trying to figure out who could have turned on that light. I knew I hadn't. I looked around, checked for signs of footprints or dust disruption. Everything seemed untouched. I shrugged, walked over to the dangling chain by the bulb and pulled it. The light went off. I went downstairs, grabbed a quick dinner, and tried to forget about it. I assumed maybe I had turned it on while exploring and simply forgot. I can be scatterbrained when I'm busy. But 2 days later, I saw the same glow under the attic door when I got home. My heart thumped harder. I actually walked more carefully up those steps this time. I gripped the railing with one hand and used my phone flashlight in the other. I noticed no signs of forced entry, no strange footprints, nothing stolen. I reached the attic door and paused, listening for any sounds. I only heard the low hum of electricity. I opened the door. Again, that single bulb was on. I stood there, breathing through my mouth, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. The room was cold. It was a different kind of cold, like a drop in temperature around me. I looked at the single small window at the far end of the attic. It was shut and the glass looked intact. No cracks, no open gap. I checked everything. Still nothing. I reached up, pulled the chain, turned the light off. Then I locked the attic door on my way out. The next day I woke up early to finish some work at home. I opened my email, made coffee, and tried to focus, but the attic thing kept nagging at me. Around noon, I went upstairs to check the door. The door was locked. I tested the knob. It didn't move. That comforted me a bit. Then I remembered that later, when I left the house for some errands, I double-checked the lock again before leaving. It was still locked. When I got back in the evening, I hung my keys by the entrance, took off my jacket, and glanced up the stairs. A light flickered through the small gap under the attic door. I froze. My mouth went dry. My stomach churned. I felt a pulsing in my temples, and my legs felt weak. I forced myself up those stairs, hating every step. The door was still locked. My keyring was in my hand, but I fumbled with it for a moment. My fingers felt clammy, and I had to wipe them on my jeans. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The bulb was on, the same faint yellow light. I walked in. The air felt thicker than before. It was hard to breathe, like the room was stuffy. I rubbed my arms, noticing goosebumps, even though it was not cold outside. I turned the light off, left the room, and locked the door again. That night I kept checking the hallway. I felt a tightness in my chest every time I thought about the light. but it stayed off for the rest of the night. By the end of the week, I was on edge. Every time I came home, I half expected to see that glow upstairs. The tension made my shoulders ache. My head pounded with stress. I decided to set aside the weekend to inspect the attic more thoroughly. On Saturday morning, I ate a quick breakfast, grabbed a flashlight, and headed up there. I left the door unlocked while I looked around. I examined every inch of the attic. I lifted old sheets from the furniture, checked under chairs and tables, and tried to open the boxes. The cardboard of some was damp and it crumbled around the edges. Inside, I mostly found old clothes, old photo frames, some books, and some kitchenware that looked vintage. Everything smelled musty. Dust particles floated in the air when I moved items around. There was no sign of rats, no sign of squirrels or anything alive. About an hour into my search, I stood in the center of the attic, breathing fast because of the stale air and the effort of moving boxes. That was when I felt a sudden draft around my ankles. It was a quick rush of cold air, strong enough that I felt it on my skin. I spun around, expecting to see a window open. But the window was closed, locked from the inside. I double-checked. No cracks in the wall, no hole in the roof. I moved my hand around trying to locate a source of air, but I found nothing. My chest tightened. My heart pounded faster. I noticed my hands shaking a bit. It lasted only a few seconds. Then it was gone. I decided I'd seen enough. I pulled the chain on the light, watched it go dark, and left the attic. I locked the door carefully. I even tested the door 3 times to make sure it was secured. After that, I put the key in a small wooden box in my bedroom drawer. I didn't want to think about it anymore. For the rest of that weekend, I busied myself with cleaning, laundry, grocery shopping, and organizing my home office downstairs. I tried not to look upstairs. I tried not to think about the draft or the light. On Sunday night, I settled on the couch to watch TV. I kept the volume low, and my mind drifted to work projects. I actually felt a little better. On Monday, I left for work around 7 in the morning. I made sure to check the attic door. It was locked and the light was off. Satisfied, I locked up the house, drove to the office, and spent the day trying to concentrate on my tasks. I got home around 6 in the evening. When I stepped inside, the house felt quiet. Too quiet. I set my bag down and walked to the bottom of the stairs. There was a weak glow under the attic door again. My stomach clenched. My forehead broke out in a sweat. I could feel my heart thumping so hard that I thought I'd get dizzy. I forced myself to go up. My legs felt shaky. I walked slowly, one step at a time, until I stood outside the attic door. I glanced at the doorknob. It was locked. That was impossible, I told myself. I took the key from my bedroom and unlocked the door. The overhead bulb was bright enough that it made me squint for a moment. Everything looked the same. Boxes in the same position, furniture untouched. The dust on the floor seemed undisturbed, but the light was on. I stepped inside and felt that strange drop in temperature again. My arms tingled with goosebumps, and I rubbed them quickly. The air smelled stale, almost sour. I pulled the chain, turned the light off, and left. I locked the door. I went to my kitchen, got a glass of water, and gulped it down while leaning on the counter. My legs were jittery, and I couldn't stop tapping my foot. I had no explanation for this. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could think of. I checked the wiring in the attic, though I'm not an electrician. I examined the switch, the chain, the fixture. I found nothing broken or defective. I replaced the bulb just in case. But every time I came home, the light was on. Sometimes I heard a faint click above me when I was downstairs, like a switch flipping. It was soft, like a distant thud, but I couldn't always tell if it was real or if I was imagining it. I started feeling paranoid. I locked the attic door, double-checked it, and kept the key hidden in my bedroom. Some nights I woke up in a sweat and looked at my bedroom doorway, certain I heard footsteps above me. Other times I thought I heard a creak, like someone was shifting their weight on the floorboards upstairs. I forced myself to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old house settling. But deep inside, I felt uneasy. My breathing would speed up, and my mind would race. One afternoon, I decided I had to confront it directly. I grabbed a small chair from my living room, took it up to the attic, and placed it near the wall switch for the overhead fixture. I wanted to sit there in silence for a while, see if anything happened. I locked the attic door from the inside and put the key in my pocket. I sat on that chair for at least an hour. My legs started to ache. My back felt stiff. I heard my own heartbeat. The overhead bulb stayed off, and the entire attic was dimly lit only by the small window. After a while, I thought maybe I was overreacting. My stomach growled, and I decided to leave. As I stood up, I got that sudden blast of cold air again, right around my knees. My hair stood on end. My arms prickled with fear. I took a step back, and the old floor groaned under my weight. I nearly dropped the key as I tried to unlock the door. My hands were shaking badly. I turned the knob and stumbled out into the hallway, locking the door behind me. I pressed my forehead against the wall and took a few slow breaths. My shirt was damp at the collar, and I wiped my neck with the back of my hand. My skin felt clammy. I didn't hear or see anything else, but that moment confirmed to me that something was off. I continued living there, but my routine changed. Every time I left the house, I made sure the attic door was locked and the light was off. Every time I came home, I went straight to the second floor to check. Most days, the light was on again. I tried leaving my phone to record video, but the battery drained unexpectedly. I tried setting up a lamp timer that would control the overhead fixture, but it wouldn't work with that simple pull chain system. The frustration built up. My nights were restless. My job performance suffered because I was distracted and tense. One morning, I decided I needed professional help. I called an electrician who came over, checked the wiring, and told me everything looked fine. When I asked him about the light turning on by itself, he just shrugged and said he didn't see any faulty switch or loose connection. After he left, I sat on my couch, feeling a knot in my stomach. My heart was pounding, and I had a headache. I didn't know what else to do. I still live in this house. The attic remains locked, and I keep the key guarded. I'm tired of checking every night, but I do it anyway. About twice a week, I come home and see that glow under the attic door. My pulse speeds up every time. My mouth goes dry, and I feel this crawling sensation on my back and arms. I open the door, turn off the light, lock it, and walk away. That's my routine. There are no footprints, no marks, and no missing items. Just that single bulb illuminating the dust and old furniture, and those sudden pockets of cold air that make my teeth chatter. I have no explanations. There's no sign of anyone breaking in or messing with me. The neighbors seem friendly and normal. The house is quiet most of the time, except for those weird creaks and drafty spots in the attic. I try to ignore it and focus on my work, but I feel constantly on edge. I catch myself glancing up toward the attic door during the day, almost expecting it to swing open or for some noise to echo from above. I guess I learned to live with it. I keep the door locked, the key hidden, and my guard up. I wish I could say I found a solution. But for now, this is my life. Me, this old house, and that damn attic light that never stays off. Even though I'm the only one here, it doesn't feel like it. I'm reminded of that fact every time I see that soft glow seeping out from the attic door when I get home, as if someone's up there ignoring my wishes. And every time I feel that cold draft by my ankles, I know I'm not alone. I still remember the first time I heard someone whisper my name in that building. It was late at night and I was tired from work. My store closes at 10, but by the time I clean up and handle the register, it's usually 10:30 or later. That night, I was climbing the stairs to my floor and I paused for a second because I heard what sounded like my name. It was low and drawn out, almost like a hiss. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it startled me enough to look around. The corridor was dim, with old light fixtures hanging near the ceiling. The paint on the walls had that grayish tint that comes from decades of wear. I didn't see anyone, so I kept walking. I felt a little uneasy, but I chalked it up to fatigue. I live in a 4-story building from the 1950s. It's not very tall and the hallways are narrow. The stairs are steep and the steps creak if you don't walk carefully. The elevator was removed years ago, probably because it was too expensive to maintain. According to the older residents, the building used to be lively, with parties on the rooftop in the summertime. Now it's mostly quiet. People keep to themselves. The walls are thin, so I can sometimes hear conversations through the vents, but nobody seems to hang around in the corridors. The caretaker, or zelador, as we call him, usually leaves by 7 p.m. He's an older guy who doesn't like working nights. He told me once that he used to do overnight shifts, but he had some bad experiences with leaks and strange noises in the basement. He never elaborated, and I didn't push. On that particular night, after hearing the whisper, I just went to my apartment, locked the door, and watched TV for a bit before passing out on the couch. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck, got ready, and went off to work. I didn't think much about the whisper after I left. The day was busy, as usual, with customers coming in looking for last-minute items. My store isn't huge, but we sell a mix of everything: groceries, household items, and random goods. By the time we closed, I was completely drained, but I felt accomplished. I like that feeling of having worked a full day. Around 10:20 p.m., I was locking up the store. I turned off the lights and set the alarm. I walked a few blocks to my building, which sits on a quieter street. The city can be noisy in certain areas, but my block is usually calm at that hour. The street lamps cast a weak yellow light on the sidewalk. A few cars were parked along the curb, but no one was around. I reached the front door of my building, fumbled for my keys, and noticed how quiet it was inside. Sometimes the caretaker leaves a hallway radio on, but that night there was no sound. I stepped into the lobby. The overhead light buzzed a little, and there was a slight flicker. I looked at the caretaker's small office. The door was closed, and the lights were off, so I knew he was gone. I glanced at the old mailboxes on the wall, metal boxes with peeling paint and little name tags. Mine was empty as usual. I don't get much mail besides bills. Then I heard it again. A low voice calling my name. I froze. It came from somewhere near the stairwell. I walked closer, feeling my pulse thudding in my neck. I leaned over the railing to look down the small staircase that leads to the basement. I saw the door to the sub-basement area, the one where the water meters and pipes are. It was cracked open. Usually that door is locked. The caretaker doesn't like people going down there because it's cramped and sometimes floods during heavy rain. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" I waited. No response. The building felt oppressively quiet. The old pipes in the wall sometimes click, but that night there was nothing. No hum of a washing machine, no faint TV sounds. Just silence. I figured maybe the caretaker was still around, even though his shift ends earlier. Sometimes he stays late to fix something, so I decided to check. I walked down the steps, keeping my ears open for any sound. When I reached the basement level, I put my hand on the door. It felt a little chilly, like the basement was cooler than the rest of the building. I pushed it open gently and looked inside. The only light came from a tiny bulb above, flickering and casting weird shadows. Rows of pipes ran along the walls, and the floor was rough concrete. It smelled faintly of dampness and rust. I took a few steps in. "Hey, anyone here?" My voice echoed slightly. Nothing. No caretaker, no neighbor, nobody. The water pipes were silent, which meant there was no leak or anything else going on. I felt a tingle on the back of my neck. My instincts told me to leave. Something was off. But I also felt that I should check if a valve had been left open, because the door being unlocked was unusual. I walked deeper into the room, passing by the old water heaters and the collection of spare parts the caretaker keeps on a wooden shelf. I listened carefully for dripping water, but heard nothing. As I turned around to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped. My stomach lurched, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I ran to the door and tried the knob. It was stuck at first. I yanked it hard, and for a second, it felt like someone was holding it from the other side. Then it gave way. I nearly stumbled backward into the hallway. I braced myself against the wall, breathing fast. I looked around, expecting to see someone messing with me, but the hallway was empty. I shouted, "That's not funny!" but nobody responded. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time, not even bothering to turn off the basement light. My palms were clammy and I could feel sweat trickling down my spine. Once I reached the first floor, I steadied myself for a moment, catching my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. After a few seconds, I continued to my apartment. I locked the door behind me, slid the chain across, and checked the peephole. Everything looked normal in the hallway, just the faint glow from the overhead light. I felt my hands shaking, so I sat down on the couch and tried to calm down. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the door slamming and that strange feeling I got in the basement. My mind kept replaying that moment when I heard my name whispered from somewhere near the stairwell. I wondered if a neighbor was pulling a prank, but it didn't make sense. Most of my neighbors are older, and they're usually in bed by that hour. None of them seem like the type to stand around in the dark basement to scare somebody. The caretaker has no reason to do that either. He barely interacts with me besides saying hi when we cross paths in the lobby. In the morning, I felt groggy and uneasy. I went to work but couldn't focus well. I told a coworker what happened, and he said maybe I was overtired, or maybe I did hear the caretaker, but he left before I got to the door. Part of me wanted to believe that, but the door slamming was too vivid. That sensation of it being stuck and then suddenly opening still gave me chills. The next few nights I avoided the basement. I used the stairs to go up to my apartment, but I tried not to look in that direction. I sometimes felt like the corridor lights were dimmer, but that might have been my imagination. After about a week, my curiosity got the better of me. I saw the caretaker on a Saturday morning when I was leaving to run errands. I approached him casually. "Hey," I said. "The other night I thought I heard you in the basement. Did you happen to be there late?" He looked puzzled. "No," he answered. "I'm never here past 7 p.m. You know that." I told him the door to the sub-basement was unlocked and I heard my name being called. He shrugged. "Strange," he said. "I always lock it. Maybe someone else needed to check the meters and forgot to close it." Then he changed the subject, asking if everything was okay with my water pressure. He didn't seem interested in discussing the noise I heard. Days turned into weeks. I started noticing little things. Sometimes when I got home at night, the door to the basement looked slightly ajar. I thought maybe the caretaker was checking something, but whenever I looked downstairs, it was dark. One time I swore I saw a faint light flicker under the door, like someone was inside with a flashlight. But when I went to check, the door was locked. Another night I heard soft footsteps in the corridor as I was heading to my apartment, but I didn't see anyone. I spun around quickly, but the corridor was empty. The lights flickered and I got that tingling feeling on the back of my neck again. I started getting jumpy. Every little sound in the hallway made me tense up. I made sure to get home earlier whenever I could, so I wouldn't have to climb those stairs alone so late. But my work schedule isn't flexible. Some nights I still end up closing, and I can't leave before 10:30. On those nights, I always double-check the street before going in, just to make sure there's no one lurking around. The lobby still feels too quiet sometimes, like the building is holding its breath. One evening, around 2 weeks after that basement incident, I had another unsettling experience. I was unlocking my apartment door and I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. I turned and saw a shadow move near the stairwell. It was just a glimpse, like someone darted out of view. My whole body tensed up. I called out, "Who's there?" Silence. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on my doorknob, my heart picking up speed. I thought about walking over to check, but the thought of going near that stairwell at night made my skin crawl. I quickly went inside and locked my door. For the next hour, I sat on my couch listening for any noise outside. I heard faint creaks, but that's common in old buildings. Eventually, I calmed down and went to bed, but I slept fitfully, waking up at every small noise. Over time, I tried telling myself it was all in my head. Maybe the stress of working late and living in an old building was messing with me. The corridors are dimly lit, the building is old, and sometimes old structures make strange noises. It could be pipes rattling or the wind pushing against a loose window frame. But I couldn't shake off that memory of the door slamming in the basement and feeling like it was held shut. One Friday night, I had a close friend over. He was curious about my place, since he'd heard me mention the weird vibes in the building. We ordered takeout, watched a movie, and then he left around 11:30 p.m. I walked him to the front door. As we reached the lobby, we both heard a low creak coming from the basement stairs. He looked at me and asked, "Does that happen a lot?" I shrugged, feeling my heart rate go up. "Sometimes," I said quietly. He shook his head but didn't say anything else. After he left, I locked the front door and hurried back upstairs, making sure to avoid looking at the basement entrance. The caretaker never brought up any strange incidents, and none of my neighbors mentioned hearing anything unusual. Still, every so often, that sub-basement door is slightly ajar. I've asked around, but no one seems to know who goes in there. Some people say the caretaker has a workshop in the back. Others say it's just an unused storage area. I'm too nervous to explore on my own after what happened. I figure it's best to leave it alone. Now, whenever I come home late, I take the stairs quickly. I keep my eyes forward, focusing on the steps ahead of me. If I hear any noise coming from below, I pretend I don't notice. I grip the railing harder than normal, and I feel my shoulders tighten. Sometimes I catch myself holding my breath. When I reach my floor, I glance at that long corridor with the flickering lights and move fast to my apartment. Once I'm inside, I lock the door and slide the chain across. There have been nights when I've put a chair against the doorknob just because I felt uneasy. I know it seems paranoid, but I don't care. I'd rather feel a little silly than let my guard down. I've thought about moving out, but the rent here is cheap and it's close to my job. Plus, aside from that creepy basement incident, nothing else has actually harmed me. It's more of an ongoing tension, like there's something off that I can't explain. I keep telling myself that as long as I steer clear of the sub-basement, I'll be fine. I don't want to push my luck. Something about that dark space gives me chills. The memory of the door slamming still pops into my head sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. My heart starts racing and I have to do breathing exercises to calm down. I don't know what's really going on in this building. Maybe there's a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a joke on me that night. But the caretaker insists he wasn't around, and I can't think of who else would be down there. The idea of a stranger sneaking into the basement is unsettling. The locks aren't the strongest, but we've never had reports of break-ins. Either way, I've learned to trust my instincts. If something feels wrong, I stay away. So that's why I don't go near the basement door anymore. If I see it open, I walk straight past it. If I hear noises, I ignore them. I figure if whoever or whatever is down there wants to stay hidden, I'm not going to interfere. I just want to live my life, pay my rent, and get home from work in one piece. The building might have its secrets, but as long as they stay in the sub-basement, that's fine by me. I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just a guy who works late and wants to sleep without worrying that someone, or something, is calling my name from the shadows. I never thought my own balcony would become a place that made me feel uneasy. But about a week ago, something changed, and now I can't sit out there without feeling like I'm being watched. I'm 38 years old, I live in a building that isn't very old, and I work regular hours at an office downtown. Most evenings, I get home around 7 p.m., eat a quick dinner, and then relax on my balcony with the lights out. I like the dark, and I like the quiet. But recently I started noticing a shape in the window of the building across from mine, and it seems to be looking right at me. I first noticed it on a Monday night. I remember it was around 9:30 p.m. My living room was dark because I had turned off the light to see the street below without reflection. I stepped out to the balcony, leaned on the railing, and glanced at the building across from mine. It's about the same height as my building, maybe 2 years older, and the apartment in question is on the 4th floor. I could see a bright window with someone standing there. At first, I didn't think much of it. People stand by their windows all the time. But this was different. That person wasn't moving at all. It was just a silhouette, perfectly still, facing me. I looked away for a moment, thinking maybe it was a mannequin or something else. But when I looked back, it was still there. exactly in the same spot. I felt a weird chill in my arms and legs. I tried to ignore it and took a sip of my water. After a couple of minutes, I realized I was still staring. The silhouette didn't shift or turn away, and the light in that apartment stayed on. I started thinking maybe the occupant put something in the window, like a coat rack or a weird lamp. But the shape looked too much like a person's outline. The shoulders were defined, and there was a slight curve where the head would be. I decided to lift my hand and wave just to see if I'd get a reaction. Nothing happened. The figure stayed still. I waited about 10 minutes, telling myself, okay, if it's a person, maybe they're on the phone or something. But there were no movements. No flicker of a hand or tilt of a head. No sign of breathing. It was just a dark shape in front of that bright light. Then, out of nowhere, it was gone. I can't even describe how it disappeared. It wasn't like someone turned off the light or pulled back. It was just there 1 second and not there the next. My stomach felt weird and my mouth went dry. I went back inside, turned on the TV, and tried to forget about it. The next night I found myself rushing through dinner so I could check that same window. By 9:30 p.m., I turned off my living room light and stepped onto the balcony. I looked at the same spot. Nothing. The light in that apartment was off and there was no sign of anyone. I waited a few minutes, leaning against the wall. After a while, I felt a little silly. I figured I'd probably spooked myself. Maybe it was just a visitor or a neighbor I hadn't noticed before. I turned around to go back inside, and that's when I saw the light flick on in that apartment. My heart started racing. I looked straight at the window, but I didn't see anything at first. Then, about a minute later, the silhouette appeared right in front of the window again. No movement, no gestures, just the same shape staring out, aligned with my balcony. I stepped forward, trying to see if it was a woman or a man. I couldn't tell. It was just a dark figure. My face felt hot, and I felt a prickling sensation on my scalp. My hands were damp with sweat. I stood there, not sure what to do. After a few minutes, I lifted my hand to wave again. No response. I almost said something out loud, but then I realized we were too far apart to hear each other and I didn't want to shout. I stayed there for another 5 minutes, feeling my stomach tighten. Then I blinked, and the shape was gone again. The light stayed on, but the silhouette wasn't there anymore. I went inside, locked my balcony door, and sat on my couch. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my ears. I barely slept that night. On Wednesday, I tried to tell myself I wouldn't look, but by 9 p.m. I started to get restless. I couldn't concentrate on my book, and the TV felt too loud. I turned everything off and walked to the balcony door. I told myself I'd just peek for a second. When I stepped outside, the light was already on in the same apartment. I saw the silhouette right away. It was there, standing motionless. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. I looked around my own building to see if any of my neighbors on my side of the street were outside. Nobody was. I leaned on the railing again, trying to see if I could make out any details. The silhouette never moved, not even a slight shift in posture. After about 10 minutes, I started getting frustrated. My chest felt tight and my breathing got heavier. It was like I was waiting for it to do something. I wanted a sign that this was a real person. But I also felt scared. I wanted to shout, "Hey, do you need something?" But I stopped myself. Eventually, I walked back inside. I left the balcony door open a crack so I could keep an eye on that window. Every few minutes, I'd glance over. The shape remained there for a long time. Finally, around 10 p.m., I looked out, and it was gone. The light was still on, though. I closed the door and decided to watch something funny on TV until I calmed down. By Thursday, I couldn't pretend this was normal. I mentioned it to a friend at work, just in passing. He told me I was probably seeing a shadow or a piece of furniture. I said I didn't think so. He laughed and said maybe I was losing it. I tried to laugh with him, but I didn't find it funny. The rest of the day, I felt anxious and kept checking the time, dreading going home. That night, I almost convinced myself not to look out my balcony. But when the clock hit 9 p.m., I got up from my couch, turned off my living room light, and stepped outside again. I felt the cool air on my face. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The silhouette was already there. Same position, same stillness. My stomach churned. I looked at the shape and said under my breath, "Who are you?" I couldn't hear anything from that side. I could feel my heartbeat hammering against my chest. I walked back inside and grabbed my binoculars from a drawer in my bedroom. I sometimes use them for watching birds at the park, so I figured maybe I could see more details. I returned to the balcony and raised them to my eyes. I expected to see a face or some distinguishing feature. Instead, all I saw was a dark outline with no visible details. The light behind the figure was bright enough to wash out anything else. It made me feel uneasy, like I was looking at a cutout. I carried those binoculars back inside, feeling more rattled. I sat on my couch thinking about possibilities. Maybe it was someone messing with me. Maybe some neighbor noticed I like to sit with my lights off, and they were playing a prank. I felt my head pounding. Around 10 p.m., I went back to check. The silhouette was gone again, just like before. I turned off all my lights and tried to sleep. My mind raced with images of that figure in the window. I woke up several times that night, sweating and glancing at my clock. On Friday after work, I stopped by the lobby of my building and talked to our doorman, Paolo. I asked him if he knew anyone in the building across the street. He said he didn't, but he sometimes waved at their security guard. I asked him if he'd ever heard any complaints about strange people looking into windows. He just shook his head and said he never heard of such a thing. I didn't mention the silhouette directly because I felt embarrassed, but I was hoping for some clue. Paolo just told me that building was a standard residential place, nothing special. I thanked him and went upstairs. That night, I decided to skip the balcony. I kept all my lights on and played video games for a while. Around 11 p.m., my curiosity got the best of me. I walked over to the window next to my balcony door, turned off just that one lamp, and peeked out through the glass. The apartment on the 4th floor was dark, no silhouette. I felt a little relieved. I turned around to head to my bedroom, and that's when I saw a flash of light from that apartment. It went from dark to bright in a second. I froze. I stepped closer to the window, my face almost pressing against the glass. There it was again, the silhouette. I felt a rush of heat in my chest, and I could hear my breathing getting quicker. I didn't even go out to the balcony this time. I just stood there watching from behind the window. After maybe 5 minutes, I backed away and closed the curtain, leaving just a small gap so I could peek without being seen. The silhouette stayed there until I finally fell asleep on my couch around midnight. On Saturday morning, I tried to be proactive. I decided I would walk across the street and see if I could figure out which apartment is directly across from mine. I counted the floors and windows from outside. It's the 4th floor, 3rd window from the left, which means it's probably apartment 403. I thought maybe I'd ring the buzzer or try to ask the doorman over there. But when I got to the entrance, the doors were locked, and I didn't see any staff. There was a panel of buzzers, but I didn't feel comfortable pressing 403 out of nowhere. I stood there for a minute, feeling a little ridiculous. Then I walked back to my building, telling myself I would try again another day. That evening, I had a friend invite me for a beer, and we ended up hanging out until late. I got home around midnight feeling a bit tired. Part of me wanted to go straight to bed. Another part of me was curious if the silhouette would be there at that hour. I pulled up a chair by my balcony door, switched off the lights, and looked through the glass. The window across the street was dark. I took a seat, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. My head felt heavy from the beer, but I was alert enough to notice any change. After 10 minutes, the light in that apartment came on. My pulse sped up. I clenched my jaw. I leaned forward in the chair and watched. The silhouette appeared again, standing in the exact same place. I whispered to myself, "This is insane." I sat there, my back tense, my legs shaking a bit. The shape stood there, not moving, not reacting. I reached for my phone and opened the camera. I tried to zoom in, but it was too dark and too far for a clear shot. My hands trembled while I tried to steady the phone. The video looked like a blurry mess. I gave up and just stared at that shape again. After a few more minutes, I stood up slowly, walked to the balcony door and slid it open an inch. I didn't say anything, but I stood there, half inside and half outside. The silhouette remained. Then, after about 5 minutes, it disappeared again, just like it had every time before. On Sunday, I stayed home most of the day, going about my chores. I cleaned the kitchen, did laundry, and tried to keep my mind off that window. But as night approached, I felt that nervous energy building up in my chest again. It was like a knot forming under my ribcage. Around 9 p.m., I turned off the living room light, went to the balcony, and looked across. The apartment window was dark. I stood out there, leaning against the railing. Every little sound made me flinch. A car door slamming, a neighbor's TV from another balcony, the distant hum of traffic. I stared at that 4th-floor window, waiting. After about 15 minutes, the light blinked on. The silhouette was already there, as if it had been waiting in the dark for the right moment to show itself. My arms went cold. My heart pounded. I took a step backward, then another. I tried to keep my eyes locked on the shape, but I felt a surge of anxiety in my chest. My breathing got shallow. I waved again, a quick motion, just to see if it would respond. Nothing. I clenched my fists, then forced myself to relax. I started thinking about going back inside, maybe turning on the TV. But I stayed a little longer, hoping for any small movement. I began to wonder if this is some kind of reflection or if there's something in that apartment that creates a human-like shape. But I've used binoculars, and it doesn't look like furniture. It's too straight, too defined. I thought about going over again, but the idea of confronting whoever or whatever it is made my stomach twist. After about 10 minutes, I saw the silhouette shift slightly. It was the first time I saw any movement at all. It wasn't much. It looked like a slight turn to the right, as if looking in another direction. Then, in an instant, it vanished. The light stayed on. I stayed there, leaning against the railing, breathing fast. I checked my watch. 9:47 p.m. I wondered if that movement was in my head, but I'm pretty sure I saw it. My knees felt a little weak, and I walked back inside to sit down. Now it's been a week of this. Every night, I can't help looking at that window. Some nights the silhouette shows up. Some nights it doesn't, but whenever it does, it just stands there facing me. I don't have any clear answers. I don't know if it's a person trying to scare me, if it's some weird coincidence, or if there's something else going on. All I know is that every time I see that shape, my pulse races, and I feel a cold tension in my gut. I've started locking my balcony door at night, even though I'm on a high floor. I keep thinking about asking other neighbors if they've noticed anything, but so far I haven't worked up the courage. I'm sitting here now, glancing toward my balcony every few minutes. It's almost 9 p.m. Part of me wants to turn off all the lights and see if the silhouette is back. Part of me wants to just leave them on and pretend there's nothing there, but I know I'll end up looking. I always do. And if I see that shape again, I'm not sure if I'll feel relief or dread. I just know I can't ignore it anymore. I knew something was off the second I stepped into the yard that night. My legs felt heavy and my chest tightened. The sound of distant machinery hummed inside the main building, but out here, everything else felt still. I'd been working at this automotive parts factory for years, and I'd seen the yard in every kind of weather and every hour of the day. But that night, something made the hair on my arms stand up. I couldn't place it. I just felt watched from the moment I left the side door. My name's James. I'm 42. Divorced. I've been working rotating shifts at this place for a while. Sometimes I do days, sometimes evenings, sometimes nights. That night, I was on the midnight shift, and I was dog-tired by the time I clocked out. Usually, I don't mind the quiet of the graveyard shift. It's peaceful when most of the crew has gone home. But I also know how empty the place can feel when it's just a few of us around. I always park my car at the side of the lot where there aren't many cameras. It's not a problem or anything. Nobody really checks. It's just habit. I don't like hunting for a space near the main entrance. The side area is spacious and less crowded. The lights are decent, and I've never had a reason to be afraid. I've done this routine plenty of times. Walk out with my lunchbox, maybe wave at a coworker, head to my car, drive home. Simple. But that night, I remember glancing at the main gate and noticing nobody around. The security guard was probably inside the booth. The place was lit but felt deserted. There was a strong chill in the air even though it wasn't that cold out. My breath was shallow. I tried to shrug it off. I started walking across the yard at a slow pace. I heard my own footsteps crunch against the gravel. The big overhead lamps buzzed. The rest of the factory was quiet, except for the low drone of equipment that never fully shuts off. I looked at the tall chain-link fence around the perimeter and noticed how the floodlights made the fence stand out in stark detail. I even saw a few insects fluttering around the lights. That's how sharp the light was. But for some reason, I couldn't get rid of that nagging feeling that someone was close by observing me. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just the fatigue or maybe the shift messing with my mind. I focused on the squeak of my boots. I was thinking about how I'd get home, maybe grab a late snack, then collapse into bed. My car was parked behind a couple of large shipping containers that we keep on the far side. They store scrap metal or old parts we don't use anymore. They're lined up in rows that form little corridors. Usually, I don't pay them much attention. But as I got nearer, I heard something that made me freeze. It sounded like voices. It was low and muffled, like a hushed conversation coming from behind the containers. At first, I thought maybe a couple of co-workers were hanging out there, which wouldn't be entirely surprising. Sometimes people head outside for a break or to chat where the cameras won't pick them up. But this was the end of the shift, and we rarely linger that long. People want to go home and sleep. I stopped walking and listened. The voices were soft, definitely more than one person, but I couldn't make out any words. It was just a blend of vague whispers. My pulse sped up. I glanced around to see if there was anyone else in the lot. I saw no one. I looked toward the security booth, but it was too far away. The only bright area was the main path leading from the side door to the parking spots. The containers stood in a slightly darker section, still lit, but not as directly. The shadows pooled behind them. I decided to call out. My voice sounded shaky when I said, "Hey, is anyone there?" I waited. Nothing. The low murmuring stopped for a second. Then it seemed to pick up again, quieter than before. I couldn't tell if I was hearing real voices or if I was just anxious and hearing things, but it sounded too real to be my imagination. I felt a knot in my stomach. My first instinct told me to walk faster to my car and leave, but I was also curious. It's not normal to hear voices in that area, and it made me uneasy. I figured if it was a couple of guys from another shift messing around, I might as well let them know I was there. I took a few steps closer, my boots scuffing on the concrete as I moved off the main path. I called out again, "Anyone back there?" My voice echoed a bit against the metal walls of the containers. It had a hollow ring that gave me goosebumps. I paused, listening. The whispers got even fainter. It was like they were receding into the background, almost as if they were moving away. But there was nowhere to go. Behind those containers, there's just a fence and open ground. If someone tried to run, I'd see them. That area is well lit enough that a running silhouette would be obvious. I walked slowly down the row between the containers. The gravel crunched under my boots. Each step felt too loud. My mouth was dry. I remember my heart pounding in my ears. My breath got shallow. I could smell a hint of oil and metal. That's normal for this place, but it felt more pungent than usual. The containers themselves were big, about 8 feet high, chipped red paint, and a few dents on the sides. I turned a corner where the row ended, expecting to see somebody hiding or at least the shape of a person slipping away. But there was nothing, just an empty gap between the container and the fence. The voices stopped. The air felt thick and stale. I stood there scanning the area. It was impossible for someone to slip out without me hearing them. The ground is covered in gravel, so footsteps would be loud, especially at that quiet hour. and there's a wide open space around. There's nowhere to hide except behind or between the containers, and I checked that space thoroughly. I walked around the entire set of containers. I even looked under them, though they're flush against the ground. Nothing. No sign of people, no leftover cigarettes, no footprints that I could see. I felt exposed. My back tingled like someone was staring at me from behind. I turned around fast, half expecting to catch a pair of eyes, but I only saw the yard stretching toward the building. The overhead lights buzzed, and the fence rattled a bit in a light breeze. My scalp prickled with sweat. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, but I didn't believe it. I knew what I heard. I stood there for a few more seconds, listening. All I picked up was the hum of distant machines and the rustle of my jacket when I moved. My own breathing sounded too loud in my ears. There was no wind to speak of, so every tiny noise stood out. But those voices were gone. I felt an urge to get out of there. I headed back toward my car. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The whole yard looked normal at first glance. Just the same old asphalt, the same big lamps, the same forklift parked by the loading dock. But every time I looked, I expected to see a figure watching me from behind the containers. I thought maybe I'd catch a glimpse of a face or a shadow. But there was nothing. Reaching my car felt like a relief. My hands were shaky as I fumbled with the keys. I dropped them once and had to bend down to pick them up. My legs felt stiff. When I got inside the car, I locked the doors out of habit. I've never done that on the property before. I usually don't worry about anything in that lot. But that night, I felt on edge. I sat there for a second, breathing slowly, trying to calm myself. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, and I flicked on the headlights. The beam lit up the fence and one of the containers. Nothing moved. I looked around the passenger seat for anything I might have left behind, then looked in the rearview mirror. The yard was empty, no sign of people or movement. I felt relief, but also confusion. On my drive home, I kept replaying the moment I heard those voices. They were definitely there. I wasn't imagining it. It sounded like at least 2 or 3 people whispering, but nobody was in that area by the time I walked around. I tried thinking logically. Maybe the sound carried from somewhere else, but that didn't make sense with how clear it seemed. Maybe the shape of the containers caused an echo or something. But an echo of what? It didn't add up. When I got home, I was too wired to sleep right away. I paced around my kitchen, drank some water, then sat on my couch staring at the wall. My mind kept drifting back to that yard, those containers, those voices that vanished. I also remembered the feeling that I was being watched. It felt so tangible. I eventually forced myself to go to bed, but I slept badly and woke up 2 hours later drenched in sweat. That entire day I felt uneasy. I dreaded going back for the next shift. On the following night, I did the same routine. I parked in the same spot even though I felt nervous about it. I told myself I was being irrational. The yard was quiet again. No odd whispers this time, but I stayed alert. Every time I passed those containers, I slowed down and listened. Nothing. The tension in my chest eased a bit, but I couldn't forget how real those voices had sounded. I asked a couple of my coworkers if they'd seen anything strange around the containers at night. One just shrugged and said he never paid attention to that side of the yard. Another joked that maybe the containers were haunted, which got a laugh out of a few guys. I didn't push the conversation because I didn't want to seem paranoid. But it stuck with me, and I could tell they noticed how serious I sounded when I asked. Later that week, I was assigned to the midnight shift again. I tried not to think about it. I focused on my work, kept my head down, and got through my tasks. But every so often, I felt a chill crawl up my spine when I remembered I'd have to cross that yard alone again. After we wrapped up, I packed my tools, clocked out, and stepped outside. This time, another coworker, Mike, was also leaving. He walked in a different direction to get to his car, which was parked closer to the main entrance. I wished we had parked in the same place, but that's not how it worked out. As I walked across the yard, I heard nothing suspicious, just the same hum of equipment, the same flickering lights. But my nerves were on high alert. Every small sound made me glance around. I made it to my car without hearing any voices. I was relieved, but I still felt the lingering dread. I kept telling myself that maybe it was a random fluke, some noise from a radio or someone messing around. But I couldn't quite settle on that explanation. The next time I worked a midnight shift, I couldn't stop myself from thinking back to that night. I walked toward my car, scanning the area. It was quiet. I might have heard the wind or my own breathing, but no voices. I felt a tension in my shoulders that didn't go away until I was in my car, driving out the gate. I'd caught myself sweating through my shirt even though it was cool outside. To this day, I still haven't figured out what happened. I never saw anyone out there. I never caught another trace of those whispers. But I know what I heard. It felt too real to dismiss. Some nights I can't help but stand by the factory door watching that row of containers before I head out. I half expect to see people crouched there, but the yard always looks empty. Sometimes I wonder if I'll hear those voices again, or if they'll suddenly appear one night when I'm alone. It's made me uneasy about working the midnight shift, but I'm not in a position to request a permanent day shift. My boss rotates us around, and that's how it goes. So I keep doing my job and I keep parking in that same spot. I suppose if I really wanted to avoid it, I could find a space closer to the building, but it doesn't feel right to let fear chase me away from a simple parking spot. Besides, I hate fighting for the few spots up front. I've gotten used to that edgy feeling whenever I walk past the containers after midnight. I still pause sometimes, scanning the area, listening for anything unusual. Most nights, I hear nothing. Still, there's a subtle nagging in the back of my mind. I can't forget the sound of those hushed voices. I can't forget how it seemed to fade and disappear as I approached, like they knew I was there. And I can't shake the feeling that something in that yard doesn't make sense. I've told myself I might have been exhausted, maybe borderline sleep-deprived. But no matter how much I try to rationalize it, I remember the distinct sensation of hearing more than one voice. I remember the prickling on the back of my neck that made me turn around over and over again, certain I'd see someone. I remember the echo-like quality that almost lingered in the air after the whispering stopped. It's not something I can easily dismiss as a trick of the mind. I haven't mentioned it to many people. A few coworkers know I heard something, but they just tease me about it, saying I need more coffee or less coffee. I laugh it off for the most part. But inside, I'm still bothered. It's a small thing, I guess, just a weird moment in an empty factory yard. But it made me question my own senses for a while. That kind of thing sticks with you. I still work there. I still do my shifts, including the midnight ones. Every so often, when I'm alone in the yard, I'll stand still and listen. So far, I haven't heard those voices again, but I can't say I feel completely relaxed. I remain alert. Sometimes I think I catch a faint sound, but it might just be the wind or a rattling piece of sheet metal. Nothing has repeated that first experience. Yet I can't help but stay on guard. That's the entire story. No dramatic endings, no big reveals. Just a strange night in a place I thought I knew well, hearing voices I couldn't explain, and feeling like I wasn't alone. I can't say if it was my imagination or if there's something else going on in that dark corner of the yard. All I know is, ever since that night, I've looked at those containers differently, and I haven't been able to shake that uneasy feeling whenever I'm out there after midnight. I'm not used to feeling afraid in my own home, but I can't ignore what keeps happening with that closet door. It creaks open in the dark, no matter how many times I lock it. I wake up with my chest tight and my hands sweating, wondering what's lurking in that narrow space at night. I try to stay calm, but every time I see that door open, my heart starts pounding as if it wants to jump out of my throat. I moved into this small furnished studio a few weeks ago. I'm 33 years old and I've been saving money to buy my own place, so I decided to rent something modest and temporary. I don't have much furniture because I've spent most of my time living in shared apartments or traveling for work. I thought a small furnished studio would be perfect. The building is old, but the rent is cheap. The walls are plain white, the floor is a bit worn, and the only window in the living room faces a quiet street. The bedroom is just big enough for a bed, a nightstand, and a small built-in closet. I noticed the door of that closet on my first night. It's made of thin wood with a simple latch that you flip to lock it. It didn't seem sturdy or new, but I figured it would do the job. I shut it before going to bed, just out of habit, because I like things to look neat. I heard the latch click, and I remember thinking it felt a bit loose. I ignored it, turned off the light, and tried to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the door was standing open. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes, and told myself maybe I forgot to lock it properly. That night, I was more careful. I locked the door again, testing the latch by wiggling it back and forth. It stayed in place, so I felt pretty sure it wouldn't open on its own. I fell asleep, but the next morning I found it open once again. I stood there for a while with a lump in my throat. The morning sun was hitting my bed and I could feel the warmth on my legs, but I felt cold inside. I stared at the open door of the closet and thought about how it kept happening. It wasn't windy in the room, and the latch wasn't that loose. There was no reason for it to swing open by itself. I decided to improvise. I grabbed a short piece of wood from a broken chair I had planned to fix at some point. I wedged that piece of wood between the floor and the door, pushing it at an angle so it applied pressure. My idea was to make it physically impossible for the door to open, even if the latch was loose. I tested it by pulling at the door, and it didn't budge. I felt good about that solution. For the first time in days, I thought I could sleep without waking up to that door wide open. It worked for a while. The door stayed closed for several nights. Then, about a week later, I woke up and saw it open by a few inches. The piece of wood was lying on the floor, but several inches from where I had placed it. I got out of bed slowly. My knees felt weak, and my hands started shaking. I couldn't understand how the door opened unless someone moved the wood. The latch was flipped up, like it had been unlocked. That made no sense to me. I thought maybe I kicked it in my sleep somehow, but the door was on the other side of the room. I don't sleepwalk. I've never had that issue. I tried to laugh it off, but my heart wouldn't slow down. It was like each beat hammered an alarm into my mind, telling me something was off. I walked around the studio, checking the windows and the front door, but nothing else was disturbed. The front door was locked the way I had left it. The windows were shut. The bathroom was empty. Nothing else looked strange. That night I was wide awake for hours, waiting to see if I could catch the closet door in the act. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I started dozing off. My eyelids felt heavy, and my body was crying out for rest. Suddenly I heard a soft creaking sound. I jolted upright. My heart slammed in my chest. It sounded like wood scraping against wood. My mouth went dry. I watched the closet door as it slowly moved. It wasn't wide open, but it definitely shifted. The latch made a faint click, and the door opened by maybe an inch. I grabbed my phone for light and got up, stepping carefully across the floor. The piece of wood I had used as a wedge was still in place, but it looked slightly displaced at the top. I couldn't see anything inside the closet. It was dark in there. I felt a chill spread from the back of my neck down to my lower back. Every hair on my arms stood up. I forced myself to approach the closet. My thoughts were racing. I imagined someone or something standing in there, but that idea felt ridiculous. It's not a big closet. It has a single rod for hanging clothes, a shelf on top, and a small space on the floor. I swung the door open fully. I kept my phone's flashlight on. I stepped back, wanting to see if someone would jump out, but there was nothing. The closet was empty except for a few shirts, a jacket, and a spare blanket. I tried to calm down by taking slow breaths. My heart wouldn't settle. My temples were pounding. I felt the sweat under my arms. I touched the latch again. It didn't feel loose enough to open on its own. That piece of wood was still wedged there, but it had shifted just enough to let the door move. I couldn't figure out how that happened. I placed the wedge tighter and flipped the latch again. I went to the kitchen area, drank some water, and forced myself to return to bed. I left the little bedside lamp on. Over the next few nights, I kept the same setup. Latch locked, wedge pressed against the door, bedside lamp on. Most nights, the door stayed shut. But once or twice a week, I still woke up to find it open. or at least partially ajar. Every time I felt an icy wave of fear in my chest. I tried to brush it off as an old door that might be misaligned. Maybe the building's foundation was shifting, or maybe there was some airflow that pushed the door. But each time I found the wood wedge moved away, it felt like a punch to the gut. My sleep turned shallow. I started jumping at small sounds. The neighbor upstairs moves chairs around in the evening, and I would tense up at the slightest scrape. I hated feeling paranoid, but I couldn't help it. I tried to think of logical explanations. I even considered the possibility that I was messing with myself in my sleep. But that didn't align with my usual habits. I've never had sleep disturbances before. One night, maybe around midnight, I was lying in bed thinking about work. My eyes were closed, but I wasn't truly asleep. I heard that soft creak again. This time, it was clearer. It was like the door was shifting under slow pressure. My stomach clenched. My mind felt alert. I sat up and saw the door. The latch was still in place, but it looked like it was bending outward slightly. It felt impossible. My breathing became rapid, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. I switched on the overhead light. The door instantly stopped moving. I stayed there, staring at it for at least 5 minutes, trying to process what I had seen. I decided to walk over and pull the door open myself. It was still locked. I pulled it open, looked inside. Nothing. I started sleeping with the overhead light on for a few nights. That made me feel safer, but it was hard to rest well under bright light. After a while, I went back to just the bedside lamp. I tried to ignore the door, but whenever it creaked or I found it open, I couldn't deny that uneasy feeling. I considered asking the landlord about it, but I figured he'd just tell me it's an old door or that I'm imagining things. Or maybe he'd think I'm crazy. I tried searching online for solutions to closet doors that won't stay shut. Most suggestions were about adjusting hinges or installing a magnetic catch. I bought a small magnetic catch from a hardware store and tried to install it, but the wood was warped, and the screws wouldn't stay tight. After an hour of struggling, I left it half installed. That night, the door opened again. My anxiety was messing with my appetite. I'd come home from work, open the front door, and feel a wave of tension. I'd stare at the closet door from across the room. Sometimes it was shut, sometimes it was open. If I found it open, my face would get hot. My neck would tighten, and I'd feel the urge to check every corner of my studio. I'd flick on lights, open the bathroom door, even check inside the shower. I'd peek under the bed, as embarrassing as that feels to admit. It all felt ridiculous, but I couldn't deny how uneasy I felt. One evening I sat on the couch, which doubles as my main seating area, and just watched the closet door. My phone was next to me. I was ready to record a video if it moved. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I don't usually notice that sound, but I was so focused that every little noise stood out. After about an hour, my eyes were getting tired. Suddenly, I heard a faint clicking noise. I looked over at the door, phone in hand, and I saw the latch move. It didn't flip open, but it twitched. I scrambled to record, but by the time I pointed my phone at it, nothing else happened. My mouth felt dry and my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. I sat there for another hour, but the latch didn't move again. Later that night, I was brushing my teeth when I heard a louder bang. I rushed into the bedroom area. The door was wide open, the wedge was on the ground, and the latch was flipped up. I felt a surge of cold goosebumps on my arms. I stepped forward and kicked the wedge aside. I didn't even bother to close the door. I couldn't see anything unusual inside, but I felt like the temperature near that closet was cooler than the rest of the room. I told myself it was just my imagination. My body was tense, and I could feel my pulse in my forehead. For a few moments, I stood there breathing hard, as if I had run a marathon. My eyes scanned the darkness inside the closet. The single overhead light in the bedroom area wasn't strong enough to illuminate the whole space. I grabbed my phone again and turned on the flashlight. I searched the closet, pushing aside clothes, checking under the shelf. There was nothing. It was exactly how I left it, except the door was open. I slammed it shut and locked it again. I didn't trust the latch, but I did it anyway. Then I wedged the piece of wood back in, putting all my weight into it, making sure it was tight against the door. I felt a surge of anger, like I was fighting something that shouldn't exist. Now I sleep with a small lamp on, and I keep a flashlight on the nightstand. I'm exhausted most days. My co-workers ask if I'm okay, and I just say I haven't been sleeping well. I don't tell them about the closet. Sometimes I hear noises at night, and my stomach twists in knots. I imagine the door creaking open again. My palms sweat and my chest tightens. I clench my jaw so hard that it aches in the morning. I don't want to believe there's anything supernatural going on, but I can't figure out a logical explanation. I've thought about moving out, but I don't have enough savings to find a better place. My goal is to keep saving until I can buy my own house. I hate the idea of losing money on this deposit, and I don't want to run away from a closet door. At the same time, I feel on edge every night. I set up a little camera to record while I sleep. It's an old webcam connected to my laptop, pointed straight at the closet door. I haven't captured anything definitive yet, just the door sometimes appearing open in the morning. It's like it's messing with me, opening at random times or waiting until the camera's not recording. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. Every night I check that closet. I lock the latch, push the wedge, and make sure it's tight. Then I lie in bed, heart pounding, waiting to see if I'll hear that scrape of wood again. My eyes get heavy and I drift off, only to startle awake at the slightest creak. Some nights the door stays closed. Other nights it's open by morning. It's become part of my routine to walk over, shut it, and feel that strange chill. I can't see anything inside, and I don't hear any footsteps or voices. It's just me, the closet, and the silence of this old building. But I can't shake the feeling that something is inside. I know it sounds crazy, but every time I see that door ajar, I feel a rush of fear. My hands tremble, and my throat tightens. I've tried telling myself it's just faulty hinges or a draft, but I've never felt so uneasy in a place before. I don't know how this story will end. For now, I'm just a guy trying to get some sleep, hoping that one morning I won't find that damn door open again. And if I do, I'll push it shut like always, forcing myself to pretend everything's normal even when my spine tingles and my mind races with questions I can't answer. I started noticing strange things on my first week at the firm. I was new, still figuring out where the supply closet was, and already they shoved me into the sub-basement to sort through old papers. The building itself was a giant gray structure with flickering lights in the corridors. Some people joked that the place had a ghost. I didn't believe any of that. I just wanted to finish my tasks, make a good impression, and get back upstairs where there was actual sunlight. But then I heard something that first evening. It sounded like soft footsteps behind the shelves. I shouted for whoever was there, but no one answered. When I checked, I saw nothing but dusty boxes. After that moment, I felt this tingling on the back of my neck. It was like someone was watching me. My name is Daniel. I'm 38 years old. I'm not superstitious. I usually laugh at horror movies and spooky stories. But working in this old building late at night has changed the way I feel about certain things. My boss put me in charge of cleaning up the archivo morto, which is basically a big room in the basement where they keep records from decades ago. He said I was the new guy and needed to pay my dues. I didn't complain. I had just been hired and wanted to prove myself. The first time I went down there, I took the elevator. The elevator made this grinding noise, like gears struggling to move. When it reached the basement, the doors opened halfway, then jerked open the rest of the way. The air smelled like paper and mold. The hallway was dim, and the only light came from old fluorescent lamps mounted along the low ceiling. Some were blinking, some were humming. The floor was concrete, and there were thick pipes along the walls. I followed a short corridor to a door labeled Archivo Morto. Inside, there were several rows of metal shelves filled with boxes. A few wooden tables sat in the center. The entire room looked like it hadn't been touched in ages. During my first few nights, I felt bored. I organized files, sorted them by year and category, and stacked them in plastic bins. I had a portable speaker to play some music, but the basement swallowed the sound and made everything echo. Once in a while, I heard water dripping somewhere behind the walls. I didn't feel uneasy right away. At first, I just wanted to finish fast so I could go home, but after I caught that first hint of movement in the corner of my eye, I started keeping my head on a swivel. There was one evening when I stayed longer than usual. It was around 9 o'clock. The rest of the staff had gone home. The cleaning crew was upstairs, but I was alone in the sub-basement. I was flipping through yellowed folders, counting them to make sure they matched the inventory. That's when I heard light footsteps behind me. They sounded deliberate, like someone was walking from one shelf to the next. I stopped breathing for a second, just listening. My heart began to pound. I cleared my throat and called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" Nothing. Silence. Only the hum of the lights and the distant drip from somewhere in the back. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I had heard my own footsteps echoing. But a few minutes later, while I was kneeling by a stack of cardboard boxes, I heard a faint breathing sound. It was like someone was right behind the next shelf, inhaling and exhaling. I stood up fast, my head spinning. My hand started to sweat, and I clenched my fists, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to look like an idiot, but I also didn't want to ignore it. I turned the corner and checked the aisle. No one was there. I felt my pulse pounding in my neck. I scanned the area, even opened a few big boxes to make sure nobody was crouching behind them. Nothing but papers, old office supplies, and dust. I tried to laugh it off, but my nerves were shot. I remember swallowing hard and stepping back. My breathing was shallow, and I realized I was trembling a bit. I decided to check with the security guys, so I locked up the archive room and walked down the corridor to the security desk. There was only one guard on duty, a guy named Carlos. He was sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. I asked him if anyone else had come down to the basement, if maybe a co-worker had gone to look for a file. Carlos shook his head and said it was just me. He pointed at the monitors and told me he would have seen if anyone else had come through the stairwell or used the elevator. I believed him because the building had cameras in every corridor. There was no way someone could sneak in without him noticing. I felt uneasy, but I forced myself to go back. I had a job to do. I headed inside the archive, turned on all the lights, and even plugged in a fan to get some air circulating. The rest of the evening passed without any more strange noises, but I jumped at every small sound. A cardboard box fell off a shelf when I bumped into it, and I almost had a heart attack. By the time I left that night, I was covered in sweat. When I got home, I went straight to the shower and stood under the hot water for a long time, trying to calm down. The next day, I told a coworker, Lucas, about what happened. He laughed and said the place was probably haunted by the ghosts of ancient office workers who never left. I didn't appreciate the joke. I tried to brush it off, but inside I felt on edge. I knew what I heard. I knew I wasn't just imagining it. Over the next week, I started noticing smaller details. The lights in the corridor near the archive flickered more than usual when I walked by. There was a constant sense that the air was heavier in there. Sometimes I smelled a slight odor, like old perfume or cleaning products. But then it disappeared. I would also feel a rush of cold air on my neck every now and then, especially when I reached the back corner where the oldest records were kept. One afternoon, I found a file from 1975. It had a few black and white photos of employees standing near a big desk. I looked at those faces and wondered what had become of them. Were they still alive? Did they have any attachment to this place? Again, I tried not to let my imagination run wild, but every time I saw a shadow or heard a creak, my mind went back to those pictures. One night, I decided I wasn't going to stay late. I packed up at 6 o'clock right when most people left. I had a mild headache and felt stressed. As I rode the elevator up, I thought I heard something like a woman's voice calling my name, but it was so faint that I couldn't be sure. The elevator rattled, the doors opened, and I rushed out. I didn't want to dwell on it, but I couldn't avoid the basement forever. I still had to finish cataloging. My boss wanted everything sorted by the end of the month. So a few days later, I braced myself for another long evening. I brought an extra lamp and a thermos of coffee. I told security exactly what time I'd be down there and asked them to swing by once in a while if they could. Carlos said he'd check on me if his schedule allowed it. That gave me a slight sense of relief. When I got to the archive, I set up my lamp on a table, turned on the overhead lights, and tried to focus. I opened more boxes, labeled files, made notes on a clipboard. Hours went by with no strange sounds. Around 8:30, I stood up to stretch my legs. My back was stiff from bending over so many boxes. Then I heard it again. Faint footsteps near the back shelves. They weren't quick, more like someone taking slow steps. I felt my heartbeat speed up. My mouth went dry and I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No reply. Just a rustling sound, like someone was shuffling through papers. I walked closer, my palms sweaty. I had a small flashlight, so I shined it between the rows of shelves. The beam landed on stacks of old folders, some loose papers, a few binders. Then I saw a shadow move across the far wall. It was brief, just a shape passing by. I gasped, dropped my clipboard, and ran to that spot, but I found nothing. My flashlight beam shook because my hands were trembling. I checked every aisle, looked behind every shelf. The place was empty. At that moment, I felt like something was right next to me, watching me, but I couldn't see anything. My hair stood on end and I started to sweat again. I backed away slowly and hurried to the door. I figured it might be best to get the guard and have him walk with me. The corridor outside was empty. The light seemed dimmer than before. My stomach churned. I practically jogged to the security desk. I told Carlos I saw someone in there, or at least a shadow. He raised an eyebrow and asked if I was sure. I insisted I was. He went with me to the archive, flashlight in hand. We did a thorough check. We opened closets, checked behind boxes. No sign of any intruder. Carlos looked at me, shrugged, and told me he believed me. But there was nothing there now. He went back to his post, and I felt uneasy standing in that room alone. I turned off the lights and left. That night I had trouble sleeping. My mind replayed the sight of that shadow on the wall. It felt so real, and that breathing sound was hard to forget. Over the following weeks I tried different tactics. I brought headphones to block out any odd noises. Sometimes I listened to podcasts, sometimes I just turned on random songs. But the feeling remained. It was like the air in that basement was charged. I noticed I got goosebumps every time I walked down the corridor. Small things kept happening. Boxes shifted positions. Papers that I thought I had placed on one table ended up on another. I started double-checking my memory. Maybe I was just forgetting where I put them. Still, it was hard not to be paranoid. Every time I mentioned it to coworkers, they either laughed or told me I was overworked. My boss just told me to hurry up with the filing, so I kept my mouth shut and tried to soldier through. But the tension kept building. I felt anxious every time the clock passed 5 p.m., knowing I'd have to go down there again. I began to leave certain tasks unfinished if it got too late. I'd rather show up early the next day with people around than stay alone in that archive at night. I remember one more incident that really shook me up. I was checking a file drawer along the back wall. I leaned over to reach a folder at the bottom. Suddenly, I heard a whisper right by my ear. It wasn't clear words, just a soft hush of air. I spun around so fast I fell backward against the shelf. My elbow hit the metal, and I cursed under my breath. My heart was racing. My breath came in short gasps. But again, there was no one. I left the drawer half open, grabbed my stuff, and left. I didn't even care if I was breaking some rule by not locking up. I just had to get out. After that, I told the security guard that I'd appreciate if they could do a few random patrols, but the building was usually quiet at night, and they had other floors to watch. Nothing changed. I tried to talk to management about moving some of the files upstairs, but they said there wasn't enough space. The sub-basement was the only place that could store all that old paper. My boss made it clear I had to finish my assignment. No excuses. At some point, I just accepted the situation. I started doing my work in a rush, staying alert, jumping at every odd sound. My chest felt tight whenever I was alone in that corridor. The elevator ride down made my stomach twist. I found myself humming just to break the silence. Sometimes I caught a flash of movement near the far end of the rows, but when I'd check, the place was empty. Other times, I heard soft breathing or footsteps, but they always vanished. No matter how often I told myself it was my imagination, the fear clung to me. I finished the project a couple of months later. It took me longer than expected, mostly because I couldn't bear to stay in that basement alone after dark. I tried to get there in the morning and leave by late afternoon, but deadlines sometimes forced me to extend my hours, so I didn't always have a choice. Every time I was down there at night, I felt that same sensation of being watched. I can't prove anything. I never found a real person or any physical evidence of someone sneaking around, but I know what I heard and saw. These days, I avoid going to the sub-basement whenever I can. If I have to go, I wait until a coworker is free to come along. I never linger there. Even now, months later, I feel uneasy just thinking about it. I don't claim it's a ghost or a spirit, but there's definitely something I can't explain. That presence, those footsteps, the shadows that move when there shouldn't be anyone around, they left a mark on me. I'm telling you this because it still feels fresh in my mind. There's an element of dread that I can't shake off. I don't want to sound paranoid, but I also don't want to lie. Something is down there, or maybe it's just the building's old infrastructure playing tricks on me. Either way, I can't ignore it, and to this day, I refuse to go down alone. If my boss ever tells me to do another basement task, I'll find a polite way to say no. I'm not dealing with that place by myself again. I'd rather keep my sanity intact than prove my bravery. That's all I've got. Believe me or don't. But if you ever visit that sub-basement, you'll understand. And if you hear footsteps behind those shelves, don't stick around. Get out and let someone else deal with it. Because once you sense that presence, you can't unfeel it. It'll stay with you, echoing in your mind every time you pass a dark corridor or see a flicker of movement in your peripheral vision. I know I'm not imagining it. I felt it, plain and simple. And that's enough for me to stay far away. I arrived at the hospital late in the afternoon. The sun was going down and the front lobby was half lit by a few leftover bulbs in the ceiling. The air felt stagnant. No breeze came through the broken windows. I noticed a faint odor of mildew and old paint. The building had been abandoned for a while, and I could see chipped walls and loose cables in the corridor. I'm 39 and I've been doing building maintenance work most of my adult life. I'm used to dark rooms, faulty wiring, and eerie hallways. But something about this place made me uneasy right away. I told myself it was just another assignment and moved on. I had a clipboard in one hand with a list of areas to check. The main items were the electrical panels, the backup generator, and the elevator system. The hospital was supposed to be renovated soon, and my job was to figure out what needed to be replaced or repaired. Usually I do these inspections with at least one partner, but the client wanted to keep costs down. I don't mind working alone, but in older buildings it can get a bit unsettling after dusk. Still, I had a flashlight, a set of tools, and a phone. I told myself I'd be fine. I walked down the first floor hallway checking for the electrical room. The floors creaked under my boots, and I noticed several doors labeled with old signs. Some were exam rooms, some were offices. Most were empty. I kept going until I saw a door that read, "Electrical authorized personnel only." Inside, there were dusty circuit boxes and old metal cabinets. I aimed my flashlight around. The wiring looked outdated, with cloth insulation on some of the cables. I jotted down a few notes. Replace main feeds, check fuses, inspect grounding. The place was quiet except for a slight buzz coming from a panel on the far wall. I figured it was a capacitor or an old relay still holding a charge. It didn't strike me as dangerous, so I moved on. When I left the electrical room, I noticed the hallway had gotten darker. The main generator was off, so the only light came from a few emergency bulbs that flickered once in a while. I made my way toward the elevator. It was near the center of the building. I planned to check its control panel and see if anything was still operational. The corridor leading there was narrow. My footsteps echoed, and I could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. The musty smell got stronger as I approached the elevator lobby. The elevator doors had a simple metal design. Above them was an old indicator panel with those little lights that show the floors. Strangely, I saw a faint glow on the panel. It showed the elevator was on the top floor. I thought that was odd because the main generator was off, and I doubted the hospital had any working power except for a few emergency circuits. Still, I figured maybe there was a separate feed for the elevator or some leftover power in the lines. It wouldn't be the first time I encountered weird wiring in an old building. I stepped closer and pressed the call button. The button lit up, a weak orange glow that flickered slightly. Then I heard mechanical sounds above me like the elevator was starting to move. The cables groaned and I heard a dull thump, as if the car was shifting into motion. I stared at the panel above. The light slowly descended from the top floor down to the second, then the first. I waited, expecting the doors to open. My heart rate picked up, though I tried to stay calm. Nothing opened. I stood there for a moment, listening. I heard the elevator come to a stop behind the metal doors. I expected them to slide open, but they stayed closed. I pressed the call button again. No response. I tried the doors, but they wouldn't budge. I held my ear close to the seam where the doors met. I heard a faint mechanical hum. Then, without warning, the indicator light started moving upward again. It went to the second floor, then the third, and kept going. My chest felt tight. I pulled at the doors again, thinking maybe the emergency release was loose. Nothing. The elevator was moving on its own. I stepped back, feeling uneasy. I shone my flashlight around, looking for an access panel or a tool that might help me open the elevator doors. I saw a locked cabinet on the wall labeled Elevator Controls. I tried the handle, but it was secured. I didn't have the right key for it. I thought about prying it open, but the metal looked thick. It wouldn't be simple, and I didn't want to cause damage if I didn't have to. I decided to go upstairs and see if someone was messing with the panel on the top floor. Maybe there was a security guard or a worker I wasn't told about. The client had told me the building was empty, but sometimes property owners forget to mention if they have other people coming in. I found the stairwell. It was dark with only one working light that gave off a weak yellow glow. I started climbing, feeling each step creak under my feet. The air was stale and smelled of old insulation. By the time I reached the second floor landing, I was breathing a bit heavier. I tried the door. It opened into a corridor lined with old patient rooms. I glanced around. The place was silent. No flicker of movement. No footsteps. I walked to the elevator lobby on that floor. The same dusty metal doors, the same locked control panel. The indicator said the elevator was on the third floor. I hit the call button, hoping maybe it would respond here. Nothing happened. I heard faint clicks like the system was trying to respond, but there was no real motion. I shined my flashlight around and saw a sign for the nurse's station. The desks were stacked with papers and folders, all covered in dust. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I couldn't pinpoint why. I've been in plenty of old, empty buildings, but I felt exposed here, as if I shouldn't be there. I shook my head to clear that thought. I was just there to do a job. I moved on to the third floor. The stairwell got darker, and my flashlight was the only real source of light. I heard the faint hum of the elevator again, this time from above me. It sounded like it was moving. Then it stopped. My throat felt dry, so I swallowed a couple of times. I told myself to stay focused. I needed to see if anyone was tampering with the controls, or if there was a short in the system causing the elevator to move on its own. When I reached the third floor, the hallway was pitch black. I had to rely on the flashlight beam. The elevator doors were there, same as below. I looked at the indicator. It said the elevator was on the fourth floor now. I decided to keep going up. Maybe I'd reach the elevator machinery room near the top. Usually, the elevator motor is in a penthouse or mechanical floor above the highest passenger floor. I climbed more steps. carefully placing my feet. My legs felt tense, my shoulders were stiff. I was sweating, even though the building was cold. Every few minutes I heard the elevator cables. Sometimes it sounded like it was going up, sometimes down. I paused at each landing to listen. No voices, no tools clanking, no footsteps. It was just me and that elevator making its own decisions. Finally, I reached what looked like the top floor. The sign on the wall said 5. I tried the door. It opened easily, and I stepped into the hallway. This area looked different, maybe administrative offices or something. There were larger rooms with desks and chairs, all covered in sheets of plastic. The floor felt grimy under my boots. I walked over to the elevator lobby. The indicator lights were dim, but I could see that the elevator was somewhere between floors, maybe. It flickered on 4, then went blank. I pressed the call button again, out of habit. Nothing. I could hear the cable movement echoing through the shaft. I stood there, feeling my pulse in my ears. My palms were damp. I wiped them on my pants and tried to think logically. There had to be a control room above. If I could get in there, I might shut off the elevator completely or see what was happening. I walked toward a door marked stairs to roof access and tried it. Locked. I pulled harder. No luck. I looked for another route. Old hospitals sometimes have a maintenance corridor or an access ladder for the elevator shaft. I found a door labeled mechanical. It was locked too, and I didn't have a key. The handle felt stuck, maybe rusted in place. I pulled on it, but it wouldn't budge. I considered using a pry bar, but I'd left my heavier tools in the truck. I only had a small screwdriver set on me. I heard the elevator again. This time it seemed to be moving down. A low whir, a slight rattle, then silence. I stood in the dark corridor, my flashlight beam shaking a bit in my hand. I realized I was nervous, my heart was pounding. I told myself it was probably a wiring fault. Elevators can behave erratically if the control circuits are damaged. But it was strange that the indicator lights were still working, at least partially, and the elevator was actually traveling from floor to floor. I decided to go back down and check the basement or ground level machine room. Some old buildings have the elevator's main machinery in the basement. On my way back, I kept thinking I might see a light in some corner, or hear someone's voice, but it was dead quiet. Just my own breathing and the scuff of my boots on the dirty floor. Every so often I'd hear the distant clang of the elevator doors trying to open somewhere, but they never actually opened. I went down the stairs floor by floor. On the 3rd floor, I paused and looked into the hallway again, just to make sure I wasn't missing any sign of tampering. Everything was still. On the 2nd floor, I checked the same. Nothing. When I got back to the lobby on the 1st floor, I tried the elevator doors once more. Still locked tight. The old indicator panel showed nothing. No floors lit. I thought about going to the basement. I found the door to the lower level next to the 1st floor stairwell. The steps led down into a damp, chilly area that smelled like mold. My flashlight caught glimpses of cobwebs on the ceiling. The walls were concrete with pipes running overhead. I moved slowly, taking careful steps. The ground was slick in some spots, maybe from leaks. At the bottom, the corridor branched off in 2 directions. One sign said storage, the other said boiler elevator equipment. I followed the 2nd sign. The hallway was narrow. I heard a dripping noise, louder than before, and the sound of a small water pump in the distance. I eventually reached a door labeled elevator machinery. It was locked, of course. I pressed my ear to it but couldn't hear much. Maybe a faint hum of old electrical equipment. I tried the knob. No luck. I felt frustration building. I'm used to dealing with old locks, but I usually have the keys or permission to break them if needed. I didn't have either. As I stood there, I felt a vibration through the floor. It was slight, but noticeable, like the elevator was moving again. My stomach tightened. I took a few steps back up the corridor, aimed my flashlight at the ceiling, and saw the thick cables going through a metal shaft up into the floors above. They trembled slightly, then went still. It was confirmation the elevator was active, going up and down without any human input. I decided I'd seen enough for one night. There was no way to access the machine room without proper keys or the client's permission to break in. I felt a growing sense of unease. I'm not afraid of ghosts or anything, but something wasn't right about an elevator operating with zero power and no operator. I wanted to leave, report my findings, and let them know we'd need a specialized elevator technician. Maybe there was a backup battery or a separate circuit the client didn't tell me about. Whatever it was, I wasn't comfortable staying there in the dark by myself. I climbed back up to the ground floor, heading toward the main entrance. On the way, I passed the elevator lobby one last time. I glanced at the indicator panel. It was lit again, showing the car was at the top floor. Then the lights moved down to 4, 3, 2, and finally 1. The mechanical rumble grew louder. I froze in front of the doors, my flashlight aimed at them. The number stopped at 1. I heard a thump and the faint sound of the car settling behind the doors. I waited, thinking they might open, but they stayed closed. My breath was shallow. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then the elevator went up again. The indicator lights blinked as it left the first floor. That was enough. I walked out. The main doors were half off their hinges, so I had to squeeze through. Outside, the sky had turned dark with only a few distant streetlights in the area. I walked to my truck, set my flashlight on the seat, and sat there for a moment, catching my breath. My hands were shaking. I jotted down my notes. Elevator panel lit without main power. Moves on its own. No sign of anyone at controls. Machine room locked. Need specialized locksmith or elevator contractor. I closed the file and stared at the hospital's tall silhouette. No lights in the windows except that single faint glow in the elevator lobby, barely visible from where I sat. I felt a rush of relief as I started my truck and turned on the headlights. I kept thinking about the elevator going up and down without a generator, but I couldn't explain it. I don't have a fancy theory. Maybe there's an alternate power source. Maybe some automatic system shorted in a weird way. It wasn't my job to figure it out alone that night. I had done enough. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of the building in my rearview mirror. The top floor window near the elevator shaft flickered faintly. I told myself it was just an old light. I didn't want to dwell on it any longer. I had my report and I'd informed the client that was all I could do. Last Friday, right after I locked up the front door of the restaurant, I spotted a strange pair of shoes in the hallway that leads to our back storage room. They weren't any shoes I recognized, and they definitely didn't belong to my staff. Seeing those shoes sitting there made my stomach tighten. I'm used to finding misplaced items, but these looked completely out of place. They were pointed in the direction of the storeroom, like someone had been standing there, then stepped out of them and left in a hurry. My name is Marcus. I'm 41 years old, and I've managed this small, family-owned restaurant for over a decade. I've seen my share of odd incidents, but nothing like this. I shouldered my way down the hallway, half expecting to bump into whoever owned those shoes, but there wasn't a single sound back there. When I picked them up, they felt warm, almost like someone had worn them recently. That freaked me out. Normally, I'd just toss lost and found items into a box near the office, but this felt different. The thought that someone might be sneaking around our back area made me uneasy. I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking corners and shadows. I walked into the storage room, turned on the overhead light, and looked around. Nothing was out of place. I checked shelves, looked behind boxes, peeked into the small closet where we keep cleaning supplies. No sign of anyone. My heart was pounding. The silence in that room felt heavy, like the air itself got thicker. Still, there wasn't a single person there. I exhaled, placed the shoes by the hallway entrance, and shut off the lights. Then I locked up and went home. The next morning, I asked my staff if the shoes belonged to anyone. Everyone said no. A few chuckled and suggested maybe a customer got drunk and left them behind. But the idea of a random customer walking out in socks or barefoot through the dining area didn't make sense. If something like that had happened, my servers or the host would have noticed. I brushed it off as a weird situation and moved on with the day. When I went to lock up again that night, I felt tense. I kept replaying the image of those shoes in my mind. The night was quiet. The kitchen staff had left early because business was slow. I did my usual routine, checked the dining room, wiped down a few tables, turned off the main lights, and headed toward the back. I expected to feel calm once I finished, but my gut was tight with worry. I turned the corner leading to the storeroom, and sure enough, those same shoes were there again. This time, they were pointed in a different direction, angled almost toward the wall. I paused, not sure what to do. My pulse throbbed in my temples. I stood still and listened, waiting for any sign of movement. The hallway was dim, lit only by a small overhead light near the exit. I thought I heard the faintest shuffle, like fabric brushing against something. I jerked my head around, trying to catch whoever might be hiding, but I heard nothing else. I crept forward and crouched next to the shoes. They looked the same as the night before, but the toes were scuffed, as if someone had dragged them across the floor. That detail made my arms tingle with goosebumps. I checked the storeroom door. It was unlocked. I gently pushed it open and hit the light switch. The fluorescent tubes flickered a couple of times before lighting up. I took a few slow steps inside. Metal shelves lined the walls, filled with containers of canned tomatoes, bags of rice, sauces, and cleaning products. The air was stuffy, carrying the scent of bleach mixed with the dampness of old concrete. I scanned the corners, expecting to see someone hunched behind a box, but it was empty. I circled around the entire room, even pulling open the door to our small supply closet. It was empty too. The tension in my chest grew tighter with each passing second. Every small noise I made seemed too loud. I heard my own breathing and the hum of the overhead lights, but nothing else. No footsteps, no rustling, no whispering. I locked the storeroom, pulled the metal security bar down, and placed a padlock on it. Then I walked back to the hallway, trying to figure out what to do with the shoes. I didn't want them inside, so I nudged them out the back exit and left them near the dumpster. My nerves were shot and my thoughts raced with questions. How did they get here? Who keeps moving them? Why isn't there any sign of forced entry? I hadn't heard the door alarm go off and the windows were intact. I told myself maybe it was a prank by someone in the neighborhood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next couple of days were normal. The restaurant stayed moderately busy and I tried not to bring up the shoes again. I hate spooking my employees, especially when we already deal with random stuff at closing time, like raccoons near the dumpster or the occasional homeless person looking for a place to rest. But those shoes felt different. They seemed personal, as if someone was deliberately leaving them in my path. Midweek, I was closing alone. It was close to midnight. I had just finished balancing the register and was about to shut off the main lights. That's when I noticed a strange smell. It wasn't the usual restaurant odor of fried food, garlic, or cleaning chemicals. It was more like a perfumed scent, something fresh and slightly sweet, but not a perfume I recognized. It drifted through the air near the kitchen, like someone had just walked by. I followed that smell, trying to pinpoint its source. I walked past the fryer station, the dishwashing area, then around to the dry storage racks. It was faint, but it led me back toward the hallway near the storeroom. My skin prickled. I turned on the hallway light and braced myself. No shoes. Nothing. But the smell was stronger there. I started to sweat. I wiped my forehead and kept going until I stood in front of the storeroom door. I tested the lock and the padlock. Both seemed secure. I stood there for maybe a full minute, my heart pounding. Eventually, the smell faded. I felt like an idiot standing there, sniffing the air and looking around. I left the restaurant that night feeling uneasy. My mind wouldn't let it go. I kept imagining that pair of shoes lined up against the doorway. I didn't sleep well. Every time I tried to relax, I pictured someone creeping around the storeroom while I was busy doing other tasks. I started double-checking every door and window each night, making sure there was no gap or broken lock. But nothing was out of order. A few nights later, I had a part-time employee stay with me to close. His name's Carlos. He's in his late 20s and generally a laid-back guy. I didn't tell him much about the shoes, just asked if he'd help me check the storeroom at closing. We got to the back around 11, and I noticed that same strange perfume smell again. Carlos smelled it too. He wrinkled his nose and asked me, "You got a new air freshener or something?" I shook my head and told him I had no idea what that smell was. We walked to the storeroom door. The hallway felt colder than usual, which was odd because that area has poor ventilation and usually runs hot. Carlos tried the door handle and it was locked. He glanced at me and I nodded for him to open it. He used the key, then undid the padlock, and we both stepped inside. The overhead light flickered as usual. We moved carefully around the storage racks, scanning the floor, looking behind boxes. We opened the supply closet together. Nothing. No footprints, no shoes, no sign that anyone had been in there. I felt relieved and frustrated at the same time. We locked up and headed out to our cars. Carlos told me to take it easy. I drove home feeling on edge, wondering if this was all in my head, but I kept thinking about those shoes appearing twice in the same spot. Then that perfume wafting through an empty hallway. Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it. The next day I asked my boss if we had any old security cameras in storage. He said we only had the front-of-house cameras that watch the dining area and cash register, plus one outside camera that points to the parking lot. Nothing that covers the back hallway or storeroom. The budget's tight and we haven't upgraded in years. I mentioned the strange incidents, but he didn't seem too concerned. He said it was probably a vagrant looking for a place to sleep or a friend of one of the staff playing a practical joke. I decided to let it go for the moment and handle it myself. That evening, I stayed late again, determined to see if anything happened. I turned off the main lights around 10:30, left just the emergency lights on, and stood in the kitchen area. I tried to stay as quiet as possible, hoping to catch any movement in the hallway. Minutes felt like hours. I heard the usual buzz of the refrigerator units and the slight drip of a faucet that always leaks. The smell of cleaning solution hung in the air. I started to get jumpy, hearing every little sound. At some point, I thought I heard a soft scrape near the hallway. I froze, listening hard, but then it stopped. After about 20 minutes, I ventured toward the hallway, bracing for something weird. The smell of that perfume hit me again, faint but distinct. My pulse kicked up. I walked slowly, shining my phone's flashlight around. I reached the storeroom door, put my hand on the knob, and felt a slight vibration, like someone had just moved on the other side. I stood there, trying to work up the nerve to open it. But I was worried about who, or what, I might find. My hand shook as I slipped the key in and turned it. The door swung open with a groan. The light flickered on. Empty. I saw the metal shelves, the boxes stacked neatly, the battered mop bucket in the corner, and the old sink we don't even use anymore. The smell vanished. I walked around slowly, even checking behind the water heater. It was the same story. Nothing out of place, no sign of forced entry, no footprints. My breath came out in short bursts, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I left the room, locked it up, and tried to shake off that sense of dread. I stepped outside for a moment to get some fresh air. The back alley was quiet, lit by one flickering streetlight near the dumpster. I glanced around, half expecting to see those shoes again, but they were gone. Everything was still. I looked up at the night sky, rubbed my temples, and told myself to calm down. I felt drained. I decided I wasn't going to figure this out tonight. Over the next week, I tried to keep my routine steady, hoping things would settle down. But every few nights, that perfume smell came back. Sometimes it was faint. Other times it was strong enough that I'd cough from the sudden sweetness in the air. And almost every time I smelled it, I felt like someone was watching me from around the corner. I started walking faster through the hallway, shutting off lights as quickly as possible, and leaving the building in a rush. One night, I saw a shadow move in the back hallway when I was wiping down counters in the kitchen. I dropped the rag and sprinted over. Of course, there was nothing there. I stood in that hallway with my hand on the light switch, flicking it on and off like a maniac, trying to catch whoever might be skulking around, but nothing showed up. I couldn't even hear footsteps. It was dead silent. Yesterday, I decided I wasn't going to play cat and mouse anymore. I bought a small motion detector that you can stick on a door frame. It's cheap and the alarm isn't loud, but I figured it might give me some peace of mind. I placed it at the entrance to the storeroom, tested it, and it worked fine. If anyone walked through, it would beep. That night, as I locked up, I kept one ear trained on that device. No beeps, no movement. But the perfume smell showed up again, stronger than ever, right when I was about to leave. It lingered for a few seconds, and then it was gone. The motion detector never went off. That's where I'm at now. I still have those random moments when the air fills with that unfamiliar scent. I still get jumpy when I walk near the storeroom, half expecting to see those damn shoes lined up by the door. I don't talk about it much with my employees because I don't want them to think I'm losing my mind or freak them out. I've done everything I can think of. Locked doors, checked windows, installed a cheap alarm, but nothing has stopped that creeping feeling that someone's right behind me when I'm alone back there. I don't know what's going on. Maybe someone has a key. Maybe there's a hidden entrance to the storeroom that I don't know about. I've looked for vents or trapdoors, but there's nothing obvious. The building's old though, so who knows? All I know is that I'm on edge every time I close up. My heartbeat stays elevated until I'm in my car driving away. I keep telling myself that eventually I'll catch whoever is messing with me. But so far, I haven't found any real proof. Just those shoes, that smell, and a growing suspicion that I'm not alone in that place late at night. I'm not sure how this will end. For now, I'll keep doing my job, locking up, and hoping I don't stumble across those shoes again. But deep down, I feel like it's only a matter of time before something else happens. If it's a prank, it's gone on too long. If it's something else, I'm not sure I want to find out. All I can do is keep my head down, check every corner, and try to ignore that uneasy twist in my gut every time I walk toward that storeroom door. I saw the back door was ajar and my heart started pounding right away. I'm not the type who scares easily, but something about that door being open felt wrong. I was there to water my brother-in-law's plants and feed his cat. He'd given me the keys before he left on a month-long business trip. He told me to lock up every time I left. I always did. But that morning, the door was cracked open when I arrived, like someone had been careless or had broken in. I stopped on the small concrete step outside, took a few seconds to breathe, and then I reached for my phone. I was about to call him, but I realized there wasn't much he could do from another country. So I clenched my jaw, stepped into the house, and turned on the lights in the mudroom. I'm a 36-year-old guy who usually goes to work around 8. I like my routine. I get up, shower, eat some cereal, and then drive over to my brother-in-law's place, which is only 10 minutes out of my way. It's an easy task. I check on his plants, run water through each pot, make sure the cat's fed, clean the litter if needed, and then lock up. Simple. But that day, as soon as I saw the door open, nothing felt simple anymore. I looked around the kitchen. Nothing seemed disturbed. The fridge was shut, the chairs were in place, the countertops looked clean. I walked through the dining room and into the living room, checking furniture and the TV. Everything was there. I tried to see if any window was broken, or if any drawer was open. But it all looked the same as it had on my previous visits. I locked the back door firmly and followed the hallway toward the bathroom. That's when I saw these wet footprints on the floor. They looked like they were made by boots. The shape was bigger than a shoe print you'd see from sneakers, and there was this distinct pattern in the middle, kind of square-shaped. I knelt down and touched the floor. The footprints were damp. I couldn't figure out why they were wet because it hadn't rained for days. The forecast was dry all week, so I wondered if maybe the previous night's humidity had settled on something outside, but that made no sense. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but it was unnerving. The footprints led from near the back door area into the hallway and then stopped. It's like they just ended out of nowhere. The floor wasn't that dirty, so maybe it dried up by the time the person got farther inside. I followed the path, expecting it might lead me to the living room or upstairs, but it didn't continue. It just vanished. I checked each room, flipping on lights, opening closet doors. My shoulders were tense. I noticed my breathing was faster than usual. Every time I opened a door, I half expected to see someone crouched in there, but I never found a sign of anyone. I also looked for anything missing. The place seemed fine. The TV was there, the laptop in the office was there, the game console was there. All normal. I ran my hand over my face and told myself to calm down. I headed up the stairs, which squeak a bit under my weight. The cat was lying on the bed in the spare room, blinking at me. That was a relief. The cat didn't look scared or upset. I went into my brother-in-law's bedroom. It looked clean. Bed was made. Closet doors shut. I opened them, though, just to be sure. Nothing inside was out of place. I stood there for a moment, just listening. The house was quiet. Then I started thinking maybe the door just blew open somehow. But I locked it last time I was there. He gave me the keys. He trusted me to keep everything secure. I fed the cat, changed the water in the dish, and took care of the plants. I made sure every door and window was locked. Then I left. On the drive to work, I couldn't stop thinking about those wet footprints. I called my brother-in-law from the car. He was in a different time zone, so I wasn't sure he'd answer, but he did. I told him about the open door and the footprints. He sounded confused. He said no one else had the keys, and he'd never had that door pop open on its own. I asked if he might have given a spare key to a friend or a neighbor, but he said no. He told me to keep an eye on things and maybe let the police know if something else happened. I said okay, but I wasn't about to call the police over footprints that vanished. Not yet. The next day I woke up feeling a little uneasy, but I had to go back. The cat needed food, and the plants needed water. I arrived around 7:30 a.m. I parked out front. Everything looked normal from outside. I used my key to get in through the front door this time, not the back door. I wanted to check if there were any signs of forced entry. Nothing jumped out at me. So I walked into the hallway, turned on the lights, and glanced around. The floor looked normal at first, but then I spotted footprints again. This time they weren't in the same pattern as before. They started somewhere around the front door and moved toward the kitchen. Again, they looked damp, like someone had stepped in water before walking inside. The shape was similar. Boot prints. I felt my stomach tighten. My palms got sweaty. I listened for any noise in the house. I couldn't hear anyone else. The cat meowed from the kitchen, so I followed the prints carefully. They led right up to the kitchen door, which was closed like always. I reached for the doorknob and paused. My chest felt heavy. I half expected to hear breathing or movement on the other side, but I only heard the hum of the fridge. I opened the door quickly and flicked on the kitchen light. No one was there. The cat was standing by his bowl, tail flicking. I sighed, feeling that tension in my body. The footprints ended right by the kitchen door, almost as if the person turned around and left or vanished. I looked out the back window. It was bright outside, and everything seemed still. I could see the small yard, the fence, the neighbor's house. No one was around. I locked the kitchen door. I knew it had been locked from the inside, which made no sense if someone came through it. I guess they could have locked it behind them, but that's bizarre. While I was washing out the cat's bowl, I kept looking over my shoulder. I felt like someone was upstairs. There's this narrow staircase near the dining area, and I kept glancing at it. It was silent, though. After feeding the cat, I decided to check upstairs again. I climbed each step slowly. My heart pounded harder with every step. I reached the top and walked into each room. Everything looked undisturbed. The bed was still made, the closets closed. I walked into the spare room, looked under the bed, checked the corners. The cat's toys were scattered around, nothing unusual. The bathroom was empty. I went to the small attic door, but it was locked, like it always is. I never had a reason to open it before. I lingered in the hallway. I listened. My pulse was still racing. I could hear a faint drip in the bathroom sink, so I tightened the faucet. Then I realized I was just standing there, breathing hard, doing nothing. I felt silly. I told myself it might be some weird leak that caused moisture on the floor, which got picked up by my shoes or something. But that didn't match the shape of those footprints, and I'd been wearing regular sneakers. They don't make that boot-like pattern. I called my brother-in-law again and told him the footprints had moved. He was concerned but didn't know what to do. He asked if I wanted to call the police. I said I'd think about it. We agreed I'd keep coming back daily but pay extra attention to the locks. He sounded worried. He told me to be careful. After that call, I finished watering the plants downstairs, then moved to the ones upstairs. The house was quiet, but my ears were on high alert. I noticed every little squeak the floor made under my feet. The smell of the hallway was normal, just the usual house smell, maybe a hint of old wood. Every so often, I'd feel a quick rush of panic, like someone was right behind me. I turned around more than once, expecting to see somebody, but I was alone. I made sure every window was locked, and then I left. Over the next few days, the footprints kept appearing. Sometimes they seemed fainter, but they were always in a slightly different path. Once I came in and found a single footprint on one tile near the back door. I tried to photograph it with my phone. The picture didn't come out very well, but you could see an outline of a boot. It was wet again, even though it hadn't rained. I checked the sink, the shower, everything. No leaks. The yard was dry as well. I even checked the hose outside to see if it was dripping, but it wasn't. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. I started going earlier, around 6:45 a.m., hoping I'd catch whoever was sneaking in. I'd park a little down the street, walk quietly up the driveway, and slip the key into the lock without making much noise. My heart would pound so hard I could almost feel it in my throat. But I never caught anyone. The house was always empty and silent. One morning I was bending down to check the footprints again, this time in the hallway near the stairs, when I heard a faint sound from upstairs. It might have been the floorboards shifting, but it sounded like a step. My hair stood on end. I swallowed hard, grabbed a small umbrella from the stand, and crept up the stairs. The steps creaked under me. I tried to stay light on my feet. My hands were shaking a little. I checked the spare room first. Nobody there. The bed was empty. The cat was downstairs that day, so he wasn't in there. The main bedroom was still locked. I realized that I never actually saw my brother-in-law lock his bedroom door, but that day it was locked. It didn't budge. That was odd because it was always open before, except for the closet doors. I considered forcing it open, but it's not my house. I called him. He didn't answer, so I texted him. "Did you lock your bedroom door?" About 10 minutes later, he replied that he never locks it. He asked if the lock might have been jammed. I told him it felt solidly locked, like someone turned the lock from the inside. He told me to try picking it if I felt comfortable. I said I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. Over the next week, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in that room. But there was no sound after that one step I heard. The footprints kept showing up. Sometimes I'd find them going from one room to another. Sometimes they led to the kitchen or the living room. I never found anyone. The cat was always calm, though. He'd meow for his food, rub against my leg, and then wander off like everything was fine. It made me think maybe there wasn't a threat in the house, or the cat would act spooked. But I wasn't convinced. One evening, I decided to go at night. I'd never gone after work before, but I wanted to see if it made a difference. It was around 8:30 p.m. when I arrived. The street was dark, a few porch lights were on. I parked a couple houses away and walked quietly to the front door. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and didn't turn on any lights right away. I stood in the dark hallway, listening. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight app. I shone it on the floor. No fresh footprints. The hallway was dry. I moved toward the living room, scanning the floor. Nothing. I went to the kitchen. That's where I saw them again. A set of wet footprints leading toward the basement door this time. My hands started shaking. I could feel my throat tighten. I walked over to the basement door, turned the knob, and swung it open. The steps leading down were dark. My flashlight barely reached the bottom. I stood there for a moment, listening. I didn't hear anything. The air smelled musty. I shut the door and locked it. No way was I going down there alone. I decided that was enough for the night. I'd call my brother-in-law again. On my way out, I locked every door behind me. I drove home with this knot in my stomach. My shoulders were sore from being so tense. I kept thinking I should call the police, but I had no evidence of a crime, just these weird footprints that came and went. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. The cat was never harmed. It was like some sort of game. The final week of his trip, I felt more and more uneasy. Every morning I'd unlock the door and feel a chill run through me. I started imagining someone upstairs standing in the shadows watching me. I couldn't focus on my routine. My hands shook when I fed the cat. I spilled water on the counter more than once. I knocked over a plant while watering it. I couldn't relax. I kept checking on that locked bedroom door. It stayed locked. One day I jiggled the handle harder and it still wouldn't open. My brother-in-law said to break the lock if I wanted, but I didn't feel comfortable doing that. I was worried I'd do something that made the situation worse, so I left it alone. Finally, he came back from his trip. I gave him his keys and said, "Dude, you need to look around and figure this out." He opened his bedroom door with his key from the inside. I guess there was a second set of keys he had forgotten about, or maybe I misunderstood something. The room was empty. Nothing had changed. There were no footprints that day. I stood there in the hallway with him, feeling a weird sense of relief, but also confusion. He thanked me for checking the house every day, and he said he was sorry it was so strange. I still don't know who left those footprints or how they kept appearing. But when I remember the sound upstairs and that locked door, I get a chill. Part of me thinks someone was in there, slipping out before I arrived each day. Part of me thinks maybe it was some weird plumbing or condensation problem that created strange patterns on the floor. But I can't explain the boot shape or how it kept moving. Even now, I sometimes wake up early and think about how I'd walk in and see those footprints, wet and fresh, leading somewhere new in the house. I haven't agreed to house sit again. I don't think I will. I'll never forget the night I saw that light. It still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. I was out on another work trip, staying in a small town inn I'd never tried before. I'm 36, and I've been traveling for my job for years, usually bouncing between hotels and roadside motels. But this place was different from the start. It felt quiet, almost too quiet. No big signs, no neon. Just a simple wooden door with a brass handle that looked a little dull, like it hadn't been polished in ages. The owner was an older guy with a tired face. He checked me in quickly, handed me a key to one of the few rooms they had, and mumbled something about how few guests they were expecting that month. I nodded, signed my name in the registry, and dragged my suitcase down the hall to my room. I noticed how the corridor lights flickered a bit, but I shrugged it off. Old buildings do that sometimes. Inside my room, the walls were a dull off-white with scuff marks near the corners. The bed looked clean enough. The floor creaked when I walked from the door to the window, but I was used to that. I just wanted to shower, answer some emails, and crash. The owner mentioned there were only a couple of other guests, both in rooms on the other side of the hall. The rest of the place was supposed to be empty. I remember that detail clearly because I glanced at the log on the counter and saw only 3 names. Mine was the last one. The owner didn't say much else, just that I should let him know if I needed anything. The first couple of nights were normal. I woke up, ate a quick breakfast from a little table in the lobby, and headed out to job sites. The workdays were long, mostly driving around and taking notes on different properties, shaking hands with people who barely remembered I existed. By the time I got back, my feet dragged, and all I wanted was a soft pillow. I didn't talk to the other guests, though I saw them once or twice at breakfast. I guess we were all too busy or too tired. On the third night, I stayed up late sorting through emails. My phone kept buzzing with messages from my boss asking for updates. It was close to midnight when I finally turned off the lamp and got under the blankets. The old bed squeaked every time I shifted my weight, but I was too drained to care. I fell asleep fast. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up thirsty. My mouth felt dry and I wanted cold water. I didn't see any bottle in the room and I realized I'd forgotten to buy something earlier. So I got up, slipped on my shoes, and opened the door to the hallway. It was dim, with only a low-watt bulb at each end of the corridor. The floor creaked under me. I walked toward the main lobby because I remembered there was a water cooler near the reception desk. But as soon as I turned the corner, I noticed a bright light at the end of the hall past my room. At first, I thought maybe the owner was cleaning or checking something, because the light was coming from under a door that was supposed to be empty. I paused. I knew from the check-in sheet and from the owner's own words that nobody was in that part of the inn. The door had a small sign that said, "Under renovation." I remembered that because I'd asked if I might get a different room, and he had told me that room wouldn't be available for the entire month. Yet, I saw this sharp white glow shining from the bottom of the door and spilling into the hallway. There wasn't any sound. No clanking of tools, no footsteps, no conversation. Just silence and light. I stood there wondering if I should mind my own business. I don't like poking around where I'm not wanted, but a part of me was curious. Maybe something was broken, maybe a fuse or a short circuit, but this didn't look like a flickering bulb. It was steady, strong, and almost too bright. The hallway around me felt like a cave compared to that harsh white beam. I walked slowly toward it, my heart beating a little faster. I tried to make sure I wasn't making too much noise. The floor kept creaking and I felt my pulse in my ears. My mind started jumping around, asking questions. Who could be in there? Why so late? Where was the owner? It crossed my mind that maybe I was about to interrupt something private, but I didn't hear voices or movement. It was just that bright light pouring out. When I got close enough to reach for the doorknob, the light shut off. It didn't flicker or fade. It just cut out. 1 second it was bright. The next it was gone, like somebody had flipped a switch. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the darkness. It all happened so fast that I felt a chill shoot through my chest. I stood there blinking and waiting, trying to see if there was any sound inside. I didn't hear anything, not even a whisper. My hand hovered in the air, right in front of the doorknob. Then I decided to try it. It wouldn't budge. It was locked. I pressed my ear against the door for a second. I couldn't pick up any noise. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence. I waited there a good minute, my skin tingling. Part of me thought about knocking, but something told me not to. My gut said this wasn't normal. I took a step back, looked at the door, and felt my palms getting sweaty. My breath got shallow. The entire hallway felt colder, though I wasn't sure if it was just nerves. The old floor under my shoes seemed to groan a little louder than before. I tried once more to open the door, jiggling the knob gently, but it was definitely locked. There was no reaction from inside. I decided I'd had enough. I spun around and walked back toward the reception area, got my water and tried to calm down. The water cooler gurgled a bit as I filled the paper cup. My hands were shaking, and I spilled some of it on the floor. I wiped my mouth, grabbed another cup, and drank again. Then I took a moment to breathe and think. If someone had been in that room, they had to have a reason. But why turn the light off right when I got close? And why keep the door locked if there was some normal explanation? I headed back to my room, keeping an eye on that door as I passed by. Everything was dark, and the only light now came from those 2 weak bulbs in the hall. I closed my door behind me, locked it, and just stood there feeling my heart thump. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the weird sensation. It wasn't fear of a person. It was more like my brain couldn't make sense of what happened. I rolled around in bed, stared at the ceiling, and told myself I'd get answers in the morning. When morning came, I felt groggy. My back hurt from tossing and turning and my eyes were puffy, but I forced myself to go to the lobby. The owner was there, setting up some pastries and coffee. I poured a cup and went straight to him. I asked if someone had been working on the closed room last night. He looked puzzled. He asked which room I was talking about, and I pointed down the hallway. He told me that room was off limits for the whole month. There was nobody scheduled to work until the weekend, and it was supposed to stay locked to avoid accidents. Then he stopped and gave me a look like I was bothering him. I tried explaining that I saw the light, but he just shrugged and said maybe I was half asleep or got confused about where I was. He insisted the room stayed locked. At that point, I felt a prickly sensation along my arms. He wasn't lying. At least I didn't see any reason for him to lie. He seemed more annoyed than anything else. I didn't push it further. I spent most of that day out in town. I kept replaying the scene in my head, thinking of logical explanations. Maybe some utility worker had come in. Maybe another guest had the wrong room. Maybe it was an electrical glitch. But none of it explained how the light shut off so suddenly, right when I got close, or why the door was locked and silent. And none of it explained the strange vibe I felt in the hallway. I couldn't ignore that chill in my gut. That evening, I came back to the inn around 7. It was already dark outside. I asked the owner if I could switch rooms, but he told me they were fully booked because of some local event. He seemed more chatty this time, telling me about a festival that was happening in the next town over. I listened, nodded, pretended to care, but I couldn't get the previous night out of my head. I went back to my room and tried to act normal. I ordered some takeout, flipped on the TV, and tried to keep my mind occupied. I thought about going to the bar or maybe finding a restaurant, but I was exhausted, so I stayed in. Around 11, I brushed my teeth, got into bed, and shut off the lights. The memory of that locked door weighed on me. I told myself I'd just go to sleep and leave early in the morning. I had enough sense to know I wouldn't get real answers here. I had my phone next to me in case something weird happened again. I drifted off around midnight, feeling uneasy. Sure enough, I woke up in the middle of the night again, this time with a jolt. It was the sound of something in the hallway. Not a loud crash, more like a soft thump. I sat up, listening. My heart was beating faster and I could feel my pulse in my temples. I strained my ears, trying to figure out what I'd heard. After a few seconds, there was another faint sound, almost like a door clicking shut. I slid out of bed, put on a shirt, and crept to my door. I opened it carefully, leaving the lights off in my room so I wouldn't draw attention. The corridor was dim, same as before. The bulbs on the ceiling flickered a bit. I looked down toward that closed room. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then about a second later I noticed a slight glow around the edges of the door. It wasn't as bright as the night before. It was more subdued, like a small lamp inside. I stood still, trying to control my breathing. My palms got clammy and I felt a faint sweat on my forehead. I didn't want to walk toward it again, but a part of me felt compelled. I stepped slowly, keeping my eyes on the door. Each step felt heavier than the last. My skin prickled with goosebumps. As I got closer, I noticed the glow was flickering, like someone was walking in front of a light source or moving something around. I reached a point about 5 feet from the door, and it went out again. But this time I heard a soft click like the sound of a switch. Then silence. I inched closer and put my hand on the doorknob. Locked. I tried to lean my ear against the door. Nothing. No breathing, no footsteps. Just my own heart pounding in my ears. I could feel my chest tighten and I realized my jaw was clenched. I let go of the knob, backed up a step and stared. My mind raced through every possibility. Someone messing with me. The owner playing games. Faulty wiring. But none of it felt right. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably just a minute or two. Then I forced myself to turn around and head back. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the door to open or the light to come back. It stayed dark. I slipped into my room and locked the door. I didn't sleep much after that. I just lay there listening for any sound and wondering what the hell was happening. My body felt tense, and I couldn't get comfortable. The next morning, I packed my bag and checked out. I didn't even wait for the free coffee or pastry. When the owner saw me, he asked if everything was all right, looking at me with mild concern. I said I needed to leave early for a work appointment. I couldn't bring myself to confront him again. He had given me his explanation, or lack of one, and I knew I wouldn't get anywhere. I gave him the key and left. As I pulled my suitcase out to the car, I felt a strong urge to look back at the building, at that window that belonged to the closed room. It was just a dirty window with the curtains drawn. I couldn't see anything inside. On the drive out of that little town, I tried to bury the memory. But every time I thought about that door, my stomach knotted. The way the light snapped off the moment I got close still plays in my head. I don't know what was in there. I don't know why someone would lock a door and keep turning a bright light on and off at odd hours. The owner's insistence that the room was empty made the whole thing feel off. To this day, I haven't had a stranger experience during my travels. Whenever I check into a new place, I can't help looking down the hallway to see if there's another door with a sign that says, "Under renovation." If I see one, I leave it alone. I don't ask questions anymore. I finished that job trip without returning to that inn. In fact, I avoid that entire area now. If my boss suggests it, I come up with excuses, say I'm too busy or that the drive is out of the way. I don't like admitting fear, but I don't feel comfortable going back there. Sometimes, late at night, I'll remember how the corridor smelled faintly of old wood and how the light looked against the worn carpet. It's not about ghosts or anything like that. It's about how real it felt. I was wide awake when I saw it. My body's reaction, the sweat, the chill, it all screams that it was real. But I can't explain it. Nobody ever gave me a solid explanation. It just sits in the back of my mind, unsolved. I'm not a superstitious guy. I'm not into horror stories or chasing weird mysteries. But I know what I saw and I know how it made me feel. Every detail in that corridor is locked in my memory. The quiet, the sudden darkness, the locked door, the owner's confusion, and the way I felt like I was being watched even though I never saw anyone. That's the part that keeps me up some nights. It felt personal, like whoever was behind that door didn't want me there. Maybe I'll never figure it out. Maybe it was just some weird situation that has a logical explanation I'll never hear. But I'm done looking for answers about it. I've had enough. All I know is that I still get a chill when I remember that bright light and how it disappeared the second I approached. And sometimes that's enough to make me stay far away. I got that workshop about a year ago. I remember feeling excited when I signed the lease because it had enough room for all my old bike projects. It's an old building on a quiet street, and the landlord didn't ask too many questions. I just told him I needed a place to store and restore vintage motorcycles. He gave me a set of keys, said something about the power being finicky, and that was about it. At the time, I didn't think much about his comment on the power. I was just happy to have the space. My name's Marcus. I'm 38, been working with bikes since I was a teenager, and I don't scare easily. After all, I've spent years dealing with busted engines, tricky wiring, and unpredictable customers. But this thing with the flashes of light has me on edge. I'll lay it out exactly how it started and what's been happening since. I usually work late because that's when I can focus. During the day I have phone calls, suppliers, sometimes random visitors asking if I can check out their bikes. So around 9 or 10 p.m. things quiet down. I can pull out my wrenches, lay everything on the workbench, and get into that zone where I lose track of time. I often stay until midnight or 1 a.m. Some nights I don't realize how late it is until I step outside and see that all the neighboring shops are locked up. The first time I noticed the flash, I had just walked out to grab a drink from the vending machine down the street. It was probably around 11 p.m. The block was silent, except for the hum of a distant streetlight. When I turned back to the workshop, I saw a white flash through the side window. It wasn't bright like a camera flash, but more like someone flicking a flashlight on and off. It caught my attention because I'd just locked the door. I was pretty sure nobody else was inside. My stomach did a quick flip and I rushed over. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding in my ears. I stepped in, turned on the overhead lights, and looked around. Nothing was out of place. My tools were spread across the main table like I'd left them. 2 frames for old bikes stood upright on their stands. I ran to the back, checked the tiny bathroom, glanced in the corner behind a metal shelf. Everything was normal. No sign of forced entry. No footprints or anything strange. I felt like an idiot, but also relieved. Over the next few weeks, I kept noticing that flash. It never lasted more than a second or two. It would happen at random times. Once it happened around midnight, another time around 9 p.m., sometimes even earlier. But it always seemed to appear when I left the workshop and walked a short distance away. Sometimes I'd see it out of the corner of my eye, sometimes a direct look. I'd rush back, but again, there'd be no one there. It started to feel like I was imagining things, but I knew what I saw. I decided to install a small security camera I bought from a hardware store. It's not a fancy system, just a simple camera that records whenever it detects motion. I placed it high on the wall facing the side window. I made sure it had a clear view of the interior. I tested it a few times by walking around and switching lights on and off. It seemed to work okay. For a while, everything was calm. I didn't see the flash for a few nights, and I thought maybe it was just some weird reflection or a neighbor messing around. Then one night, I went to grab a burger at a 24-hour diner down the street. I locked up as usual. While I was standing outside, about to head off, I saw that same flicker. My stomach dropped. I just stood there for a second thinking, okay, let's see if the camera caught anything. I walked in, feeling that familiar rush of adrenaline. The place was quiet and nothing looked disturbed. I pulled my phone out and checked the live feed from the camera app. It had a motion alert about 2 minutes earlier. I played it back. The screen showed the workshop, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb I usually leave on. Then, out of nowhere, the camera image flared for a second, but there was no clear source of light on screen, just a sudden brightness. No figure, no shape, no movement that looked human. It was just that flash. Then everything went back to normal. I felt a chill. I'm a practical guy, but that messed with my head. I switched on all the lights again, looked around, and told myself I was going to do a thorough check. I opened the circuit breaker box to see if there was a short or a power surge or something. Everything looked in order. I double-checked the windows, the back door, and the main entrance. Nothing. No footprints, no moved objects. The bikes and parts were all where I left them. A few days later, I decided to spend a weekend morning there, trying to see if daylight changed anything. I arrived around 9 a.m. on a Saturday. Sunlight was pouring through the high windows. Everything looked normal. I rolled up my sleeves, did some engine work on a vintage cafe racer, replaced a few gaskets, installed new spark plugs. By noon, I was sweaty and covered in grease. I took a break, stepped outside for a breather, and stared at that side window. It just sat there looking like a normal window. No reflection, no weird glare. I felt a little stupid for losing so much sleep over some random flashes. But then I remembered the camera footage. That wasn't my imagination. I started asking some neighbors if they'd seen any strange lights. Most folks just shook their heads or said they didn't pay attention to the building at night. One older guy who runs a small garage a block away said he once noticed a bright flare from the direction of my workshop, but he thought it was just me welding. I've done some welding in there, but not at the hours he mentioned. Welding is a big, consistent spark, not a quick blink. Time passed and I learned to live with those flashes. They didn't happen every night, just once or twice a week. But every time I saw them, I felt that rush of concern. I'd check my camera recordings afterward, and each clip looked the same. The interior gets suddenly bright, then returns to normal. No sign of a person, no sound, no shadow that indicates movement. It's just a blank spot of white for a second or two. I started sleeping less. My mind would race when I tried to relax at home. I'd go over every possible explanation. A faulty light fixture? But the overhead lights themselves never flicker. Some reflection from a car's headlights? Maybe. But the street is so quiet at that time, and the side window is set at an angle that doesn't face traffic. I also considered electrical arcs from old wiring, but my breaker box and wiring were updated just a few months after I moved in, and if it was an electrical arc, I should hear some kind of buzzing or popping sound or see some scorch marks. I've checked every wire I can see and it all looks fine. I tried ignoring it. I told myself it didn't affect my work. During the day, I'd rebuild carburetors, adjust timing chains, and do normal tasks. At night, though, my eyes would drift to that window every time I heard a noise or felt a shift in the air. I started to close the window blinds. That helped a bit, but the flash would still glow through them. I remember one particular night. It was raining hard. I could hear the water hitting the tin roof of the workshop, creating a constant drumming sound. I was almost finished working on a 1978 Honda CB750. I'd replaced the exhaust system and was cleaning up. Around 11:30 p.m. I got a text from a buddy, so I decided to check my phone outside because the signal inside is sometimes weak. The rain had let up a bit, so I opened the door and stepped into the alley behind the building. The alley smelled like wet asphalt, and there was a puddle near the trash cans. I had just dialed my friend to talk about some parts he had for sale when I noticed a faint flash. It lit the blinds from inside for a fraction of a second. I got that tight feeling in my chest. My friend was talking, but I barely heard him. I muttered something like, "I gotta go," and hung up. I rushed back in, water dripping from my jacket and shoes. I switched the main lights on, my heart pounding in my throat. The place was empty. The blinds looked undisturbed. No footprints, no open doors. I quickly checked the camera feed. Sure enough, there was the motion alert. Playback showed the same quick blast of light. Nothing else. I felt a wave of frustration. I swore out loud and kicked the edge of a metal toolbox. I was so tired of this routine I couldn't figure it out, and it was messing with my head. I left everything as it was and drove home. That night, I barely slept. A few days later, I decided I was going to stay in the workshop the entire night, not leaving for anything. I stocked up on snacks, water, and a thermos of coffee. I made a plan to keep my camera app open on my phone so I could watch the live feed, even while I was sitting inside. I locked the doors from the inside around 9 p.m. Then I sat at my workbench and pretended to tinker with a half-finished bike. The hours dragged. I kept checking the corners of the room, listening for any strange noises. Around midnight, my eyes felt heavy, and I thought about shutting them for a minute. That's when the overhead fluorescent light flickered for half a second, but that was normal for this old fixture. I stood up and walked around to get my blood flowing. The camera feed on my phone looked normal. The workshop was quiet except for the faint hum of the fluorescent bulb. By 2 a.m., I still hadn't seen the flash. I was tired and angry. I felt like the place was making a fool out of me. I left the camera rolling and decided to step out the front door while still holding my phone. I didn't shut the door completely, just left it cracked so I could peek back in. I watched the screen and waited. My feet were on the threshold, half inside, half outside. Then it happened. A burst of white light filled the camera view for maybe a second. I saw it with my own eyes through the crack in the door, too. It felt like someone had turned on a strobe inside. I jumped back into the workshop immediately. Everything was exactly the same. No person, no flickering bulb, nothing. My pulse hammered in my ears. I replayed the footage. The camera showed a bright flash, but no origin. That was the moment I realized there might never be a neat explanation. I don't have any evidence of a break-in or tampering. I have no reason to believe it's a power glitch. But the flash is real, and it happens whether I'm there or not. It doesn't matter what time of night it is or if the weather's good or bad. It just keeps happening. For now, I still work in that workshop. I still stay late. I still see that flash once in a while. I haven't told the landlord because I don't see what good that would do. I haven't told many friends either, because they'd just say I'm seeing things or they'd crack jokes about ghosts. But I see it. The camera catches it. It's there. And it's not going away. Every time I see the light, I get that rush of adrenaline. My hands sweat and my heart thumps in my chest. I stop breathing for a second, and then I remind myself that I've checked every inch of the place. No footprints, no loose wires, no weird devices. I try to keep calm and focus on my work, but it's still unnerving. Sometimes I think about moving to a different workshop, but I've put time and money into this place. The location is good, the rent is fair, and I have room for all my projects, so that's the story. No one's been hurt. Nothing's been stolen. But those flashes of light keep happening, and I don't have a clue why. Every once in a while, I consider leaving a voice recorder or some fancy infrared camera running, but I haven't gone that far yet. I'm not sure I want to find out something worse than a faulty wiring issue. For now, I'm just dealing with it as part of my nightly routine. I don't have a clever conclusion to wrap this up. It's just my reality right now. Me, my bikes, my tools, and these random white flashes that come and go without warning. They don't feel menacing exactly, but they rattle me every time. Maybe I'll figure it out one day, maybe I won't. Until then, I keep my head down, do my work, and glance over my shoulder a little more often. That's life in my workshop, and that's all there is to tell. I'm not here to write a fancy opening or dress this up with pretty words. I'm here to tell you exactly what happened in my house. I don't expect everyone to believe me, and that's fine. I just need to get this off my chest. If you're still reading, I guess you're curious. This started a few months ago, right after I rented a small, comfortable place with a cozy living room, a basic kitchen, and a short, narrow door under the stairs leading to a little storage area. At first glance, there was nothing special about it. I'm 44 years old, divorced, and I live alone. I don't have a lot of stuff, so I mostly keep some boxes and supplies in that storage area. It's low enough that I have to duck my head to get in, and it doesn't go very deep. Maybe 6 feet back, with just enough room to stack a few plastic bins. There's a single overhead light in there, a small bulb. The door itself has an old handle that clicks when you turn it, and there's a lock that I can slide shut from the outside. I never paid much attention to it at first. Not long after I moved in, I started hearing these faint noises at night. They were soft at first, like a gentle scraping sound. It was so faint that I thought it was the wind outside or maybe a tree branch brushing against the siding. But after a few nights, I realized the noise wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from that little door. I remember one night I was sitting on my couch flipping channels when I caught a weird, scratchy sound from the corner of the living room. I muted the TV and listened hard. It stopped. I turned the TV back on. Then I heard it again. It sounded like someone lightly dragging a fingernail across wood. I'm not the type to jump to supernatural explanations. My first guess was rodents. I thought maybe mice or rats had found a hole in the walls. But I checked for droppings, holes, any sign of nests, and found nothing. I even set up a trap with some peanut butter, then checked it every morning. It never caught anything. Over the next 2 weeks, the noises got a bit louder and more consistent. Sometimes I'd be in bed and I'd hear a faint scratching sound coming through the wall. My bedroom sits right above the living room, so the sound traveled up. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to keep me awake. Once or twice I went downstairs and stood next to that little door, pressing my ear against it. I'd hear these tiny scraping sounds like nails on the other side. It made my skin tingle. I can't really explain why, but there was something unsettling about it. It wasn't random scratching, it felt deliberate. One evening I decided to open the door and take a look inside. I switched on the overhead light in there, which flickered a bit, then shone dimly. There were my boxes, neatly stacked, with some old winter clothes I rarely wear. I shuffled them around, looked for any sign of rodent droppings or bite marks, but everything was clean. I got on my hands and knees with a flashlight, checked the corners, ran my hand along the floorboards. Nothing. No holes, no chew marks, no smell of anything dead. I stood there for a moment, feeling kind of dumb, then closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking made me feel a little better, like I was sealing it off somehow. A few nights later, I heard the sound again, but this time it felt heavier. It wasn't just a light scratch. It was like something was scraping harder against the door, like it wanted out. I remember sitting on my couch around midnight and I heard this loud scratch and a dull thud against the inside of the door. My heart pounded. I clicked off the TV and stared at the door. It vibrated slightly, then the noise stopped. I walked over slowly, flipping on the living room lamp, focusing on that narrow door handle. It was shaking a bit. I grabbed the flashlight I keep in a drawer near the couch and stood there, my hand on the knob, trying to gather the nerve to open it. Eventually I did. I yanked the door open, shining the flashlight inside, half expecting something to jump out. But there was nothing. The boxes were in the same place. The single overhead bulb flickered. It looked the same as before. My chest was tight and I could hear the blood in my ears. I turned on the overhead light in the storage space again. No movement. I poked around, checked the walls, tapped my knuckles against them. Solid. I felt a strange tension in there, like the air was heavier, but I told myself it was just my nerves. I stepped out, locked the little door with that sliding lock, and went back to the couch. I left the lamp on all night. I told a few people at work about it. They laughed it off and said maybe the house was just settling. Maybe it was old pipes. I'm not crazy, though. I know the difference between old pipes and something physically touching a door. But I didn't push the subject. I knew it sounded weird. Almost every night I heard something. Faint scraping, tapping, or a sudden loud scratch. Sometimes it was just one or two scratches, and then silence. Other times it lasted longer, like something was pacing inside that cramped area, trying to get comfortable. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I started locking the door every night. I'd also put a small wedge under the door just to be extra sure it stayed shut. The worst moment happened about a month in. It was around 1 in the morning. I had fallen asleep on the couch, the TV still on. Suddenly, I heard a bang so loud I nearly fell off the couch. The door shook. I could see it move. My heart hammered in my chest. I felt my palms sweat. I grabbed my phone, switched on the flashlight app, and pointed it at the door. It was silent for a second. Then I heard the scratching again, fast and sharp, like claws on the other side of the wood. It felt angry, if that makes sense. I stood up slowly. My legs felt wobbly. I reached for the light switch. My living room lamp came on, flooding the room with a soft glow. The door was steady now. No movement. I considered calling the cops, but what would I say? That something was scratching inside my closet? I doubted they'd come out for that. I took a few deep breaths and finally decided to open the door again. I unlocked it, slid the wedge away, and braced myself. I pulled the handle slowly, the door creaking open. That little overhead light was flickering again. My boxes looked normal. I stepped inside, feeling the wood floor under my socks. I walked around the boxes, checking them for any sign of movement or damage. I saw nothing unusual. No claw marks, no scratches, no new holes. But I felt an intense pressure, like the air was thick. My scalp prickled. I couldn't stay in there for more than a minute. I backed out, slid the lock, and turned off the living room light on my way to my bedroom. I barely slept that night. I started getting paranoid. I'd come home from work and checked the door right away just to see if it had been tampered with. I even measured the exact placement of my boxes inside, just in case something was moving them. They never shifted. I dusted the floor for footprints. Nothing. Every night those noises returned. Sometimes quiet, sometimes loud and violent. And I never found a single piece of evidence that anything was there. I tried to stop focusing on it, but it wasn't easy. Every time I sat in the living room, my eyes drifted to that low door. Every sound in the house made me jump. Even the fridge turning on made me flinch sometimes. The nights were the worst. I'd stay up, waiting, listening. Around midnight or 1 in the morning, I'd hear that first scratch. My stomach would tighten, my hands would sweat, my mouth would go dry. Sometimes I'd just stare at the door, half hypnotized, waiting for it to happen again. Other times I'd try turning on some music or leaving the TV on louder, hoping to drown it out. At one point, I reached out to the landlord. He came by, took a quick look, but there wasn't much to do. He knocked on the walls, checked the storage space, shrugged, and said he didn't see anything wrong. Then he suggested that old houses make weird noises. He also hinted that maybe I was stressed and hearing things. He was polite enough, but I could tell he thought I was imagining it. He left, and I felt more alone than ever. I considered sleeping in a motel just to get a decent night's rest. But that would cost money I didn't want to spend, and part of me felt like I was running away. I tried to tell myself that it was just some explainable phenomenon like water pipes or a draft. But then I'd hear that scratching again, and it was unmistakable. It was physical. There was force behind it. After a couple more weeks of this, I realized I needed to do something drastic. One Saturday, I decided to empty the storage space completely. I spent the morning dragging every box out, looking at every inch of that small interior. The walls were blank. The floor was plain wood. I even went as far as tapping the walls for hidden panels or hollow spots. I found nothing. I vacuumed the corners and wiped down the walls with a cleaning solution. It smelled of disinfectant, and for some reason, that made me feel a bit safer. Then I put everything back neatly. That night, the scratching returned. Right around midnight, I heard it. I was in the kitchen making some tea, and I heard a rhythmic scrape, 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 from the living room. My heart pounded again. My hands started trembling. I grabbed a kitchen knife without really thinking about it. I just needed some sense of security. I walked into the living room, turning all the lights on. The door was still locked, the wedge still in place. Yet the sound continued. I stood in front of the door, my breath shallow, and listened. The scraping was slow and steady, like nails sliding along the wood, pausing, then sliding again. I whispered to myself, "There's nothing there." But I didn't believe it. I felt a tightness in my chest, like I couldn't take a full breath. My throat felt dry and my stomach churned. I didn't know what to do. Should I open it? Should I just ignore it? Should I leave the house? My mind raced. Finally, I put the knife down on the coffee table and knelt by the door. I placed my ear against the wood. The sound was so close. It was right on the other side. My pulse pounded in my ears. I grabbed the knob and turned it slowly. The lock clicked. I opened the door an inch. The scraping sound stopped. I pushed the door open the rest of the way, shining my phone's flashlight inside. That single bulb was still there. It flickered a bit, then stayed lit. The space was empty except for my stacked boxes. The floor was clean. The walls were untouched. No sign of movement, no sign of any living thing. But I felt that weird heaviness, like the air was denser. I swallowed hard, stood up, and shut the door, locking it again. I went back to the kitchen, poured my tea, and sat at the table, staring at the living room. That night, the noises continued for about 30 minutes, then stopped. I stayed up until dawn. I heard a random scrape now and then, but eventually I just fell asleep in the chair. In the weeks that followed, I tried to live with it. I locked that door every night and wedged it shut. I kept a flashlight handy and slept with the TV on low volume, hoping the noise would help me relax. I never found any physical proof of rodents or anything else. Every morning, the boxes were in the same place. Sometimes I wondered if I was losing my mind, but the sounds were too real. I could feel the door vibrating, watch it move a fraction of an inch, hear that distinct scratch. I avoided that corner of the room after dark. I just didn't like being near it. There was a bad vibe there, and I can't explain why. It made my skin crawl. Even walking past it to get to the kitchen, I felt a small jolt of anxiety. I stopped inviting people over. I stopped watching TV in the living room late at night. I retreated to my bedroom, but the noise followed me. I heard it through the floor. It was always the same. Slow, deliberate scratching, like someone drawing lines on a chalkboard, but quieter and more unnerving. That's where things stand now. I still live here. I haven't moved out, and I haven't solved the mystery. Every night I lock that little door. Sometimes I put a chair in front of it for good measure. The noises come and go, but they've never stopped entirely. I don't have any grand conclusion or dramatic ending. I just know there's something off about that space. It's not rats or pipes or a draft, it's something I can't explain. I feel it in my gut whenever I step near that door. I'm sharing this because I need to let it out. It's been months. I don't have anyone else to tell who won't dismiss me or call me crazy. This is what's really happening. If you believe me, thanks. If you don't, that's okay too. It doesn't change the fact that every night, when the house is quiet and the lights are off, I hear those scratches, and they're coming from inside that tiny room beneath my stairs. I'll never forget the night I walked out of the elevator on the second basement level. Even now, my stomach gets tight when I think about those empty hallways and the figure I saw at the end of that corridor. I'm a radiology tech. I've been doing this job for over 20 years, and I've seen my share of strange things in hospitals. But there's something about that night that sticks with me. It wasn't dramatic, and nobody died, but it got under my skin. I can't walk past that place without feeling a spike of dread. I'm 40 years old, and I've worked at this relatively large hospital for about a decade. Usually, my shifts are straightforward. I handle X-rays, CT scans, and sometimes MRIs. There are moments when the workload gets overwhelming, especially on nights when we have trauma cases coming in back to back. But it's routine work. I get the patient, run the scan, deliver the images or place them in the system, then move on. On most nights, I barely think about the building itself. Hospitals are always full of lights, beeping sounds, and people rushing around. It's easy to ignore the quieter corners until I have to visit them. This hospital has multiple wings, and it also has a couple of basement levels. We use the first basement floor for storage and some staff rooms. The second basement is mostly closed off for renovations. I think they've been working on it for years, though progress is slow. Occasionally, I have to pick up older files or some equipment from the second basement. The administrative offices store random things down there, probably because they ran out of room on the upper floors. One night, I was halfway through my shift. It was around midnight. The emergency department was busy with a few accident cases, but after I finished scanning a patient, my supervisor asked me to grab a set of old archived images from the second basement. He said they needed them for comparison on a long-term patient. I remember feeling a small twinge of unease because the second basement is dark, musty, and usually empty. But I shrugged it off. I had a job to do, so I stepped into the elevator and pressed B2. When I reached the second basement, I noticed the hallway lights were brighter than usual. They must have replaced some bulbs. It was quiet, though. No humming voices, no distant footsteps. Just this long corridor with doors on each side, most of them locked. There was some construction material pushed against the walls, paint cans, a few tools, stuff like that. At the far end of the hall, I thought I saw someone standing there. He wore a white coat, like the kind doctors or lab techs wear, but hospitals require ID badges, and I didn't see any badge on him. I hesitated. I'm not a jumpy guy, but it was strange to see someone just standing still in a closed-off area. I called out, "Hey, do you need help? This area is under renovation." My voice echoed in that corridor, but he didn't move. He was just there, with his back turned to me. My gut tightened. I took a few steps forward. My footfall sounded louder than normal. The guy stayed motionless, facing away. I spoke up again. "Sir, are you okay?" No reply. I slowed down. I wasn't sure if he was ignoring me or if he couldn't hear me. The bright lights made it easy to see that there was no ID badge on his coat. It felt wrong. My heart pounded a bit faster. Something about his posture looked off. His shoulders were stiff and his head was tilted slightly down, as if he was staring at the floor. I glanced at the doors along the hallway, checking if maybe someone else was around. I reached the area where I'd seen him. Nobody was there. There was no corner or hallway he could have turned into. Just a locked door at the end, sealed for construction. I reached out and tried the handle. It was definitely locked. No click, no give. That door hadn't been opened recently. I looked around, confused. My palms felt sweaty. There was nowhere he could have gone. The hallway was basically a dead end. A prickling sensation ran down my back. My chest felt tight. I swallowed, then reminded myself that maybe I was tired, and the guy had slipped away while I was blinking. It didn't make any sense, but I tried to shake it off. I turned around to head back to the elevator, feeling this chill creep up my neck. That was when I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, like a soft echo. My heart jumped. I whipped around. Nobody was there. Just an empty, brightly lit corridor lined with half-painted walls and old boxes. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps had sounded clear, maybe 5 paces. It wasn't my imagination. I stood there for a few seconds trying to calm down. I scanned the walls, the floor, the ceiling. There was nothing that could have made that sound. No flickering lights, no leaks. Everything was still, but that sense of being watched crawled all over me. I told myself to get the job done. The storage room with the old files was 2 doors back near the elevator. I forced myself to walk that way. I tried to act normal, but my legs felt stiff. My breathing got a little shallow. Every step seemed to echo, and every echo sounded like something following me. I opened the door to the storage room, flicked on the lights, and stepped inside. The room was cramped, full of metal shelves stacked with file boxes. The air smelled stale, like old paper and dust. I searched for the box I needed. My supervisor gave me a reference number, so I scanned the labels on the shelves. My hands were shaking a bit. The quiet felt heavy. I was sure I'd heard footsteps. I thought about calling security, but what would I say? I saw a guy, he vanished, and I heard footsteps. They'd think I was losing it. After a few minutes, I found the box marked with the right code. It was on a higher shelf, so I dragged a small stool over. The box wasn't too heavy, but it was dusty, and I nearly sneezed. I tucked it under my arm. Then I headed back out to the corridor. I glanced around one more time, half expecting to see that figure again. Nothing. The hallway was just as empty as before. As I walked toward the elevator, I kept listening for any sign of movement. My heart was still beating fast, but I tried to keep it together. The elevator button lit up when I pressed it. I waited, shifting the box from one arm to the other. The doors took a few seconds to open. Just as they parted, I heard the sound of footsteps again behind me. I tensed up, froze in place, and turned my head to look over my shoulder. Silence. Absolute silence except for the humming of the elevator. The corridor was bright and empty. My stomach felt tight. I stepped into the elevator and let the doors close. When the elevator started moving up, I exhaled hard. My heart was still racing. I told myself it was just nerves, maybe the echo of my own steps or something. But that corridor was well lit, and I knew what I heard. I delivered the box to my supervisor and didn't say much. He could probably tell I looked pale. He asked if everything was okay, and I just nodded. I didn't want to explain the weirdness because I had no proof. I went back to my station, finished my shift, and tried not to think about it. But around 3 a.m., when things got quieter, my mind circled back to that moment over and over. I kept picturing the man in the white coat. I saw no face, no badge, no movement. He was standing perfectly still. Then he was gone. The locked door at the end of the corridor had no signs of forced entry. Where did he go? I remember feeling shaky and nervous for the rest of that night. My mouth felt dry. Even after my shift ended around 7 a.m., I was still bothered. I went home, took a shower, tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that corridor and felt that tightness in my gut. A few weeks passed. I avoided going back to the second basement alone. If a supervisor asked me to get something, I'd try to delegate it to a coworker or at least ask someone to come with me. I felt embarrassed, but the thought of walking those halls by myself made my hands sweat. One of my coworkers, Eric, noticed my reaction. He asked me if something had happened down there, and I just brushed it off. I said it was too creepy with all the construction. He shrugged and didn't push it. One night, a while later, I was again on a late shift. Our department got slammed with a few urgent exams. Around 2 a.m., we needed an older piece of scanning equipment that was stored, of course, on the second basement level. I tried to talk my coworker into going, but he was busy prepping a patient. My supervisor was nowhere to be found. Eventually, I realized it had to be me, so I grabbed my ID, took a deep breath, and stepped into the elevator. The ride down felt too long. My stomach churned. I told myself there was nothing down there. It was just a hallway, some boxes and renovation areas. When the doors opened, I expected to see that bright corridor again. But this time, half the lights were off. A few bulbs were either burned out or switched off to save power. The corridor looked darker with some shadows in the corners. My skin prickled, and I stepped out slowly. I tried not to look at the far end of the hallway, but I couldn't help it. It was empty. No sign of anyone. I walked to the small supply room on the left side. As I passed by the spot where I'd seen that figure, I felt my neck tense up. I couldn't hear anything but my own footsteps. I moved faster, reached the supply room, opened the door, and flicked on the lights. The equipment I needed was a portable lead barrier, basically a rolling shield. It was leaning against the wall, covered with a plastic sheet. I pulled off the plastic, wiped off some dust, and rolled the shield to the door. I noticed the squeak of the wheels. It was louder than I remembered. I was about to step into the corridor again, feeling a knot in my gut. I decided to just hurry. I didn't want to stand around in the hallway any longer than necessary. As soon as I entered the hallway, the squeaky wheels echoed even more. I gripped the handle of the shield and walked toward the elevator. Every footstep and squeak seemed to bounce off the walls. My arms felt tense and I could feel sweat on my forehead. Halfway to the elevator, the corridor lights flickered for a second. My chest got tight. I stopped walking, stared at the ceiling, waiting. The lights came back steady. I exhaled. Then I heard a faint scrape behind me. It sounded like a shoe dragging across the floor. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over my shoulder and saw nothing but that same corridor, the same locked door at the end. My breathing got heavier. I heard another soft scrape, closer. There was still nothing there. My heart thumped against my chest. My hands shook on the shield's handle. I tried to pick up the pace. The squeaking wheels seemed to get louder, like they were echoing an alarm. My pulse pounded in my ears. I felt a chill on the back of my neck, like someone was standing there breathing over my shoulder. I spun around, shield in front of me. Nobody was there. I practically lunged at the elevator button. The door took a second to open, and that second felt like forever. I kept looking back, convinced I'd see someone, but the corridor stayed empty, even though I had that crawling feeling on my skin. Finally, the elevator opened, and I rolled the shield inside. I hit the button for my floor. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of the far end of the hall. It was hard to see clearly, but I swear I saw a shape move behind the small stack of boxes in the corner. The doors sealed shut, and the elevator began to ascend. By the time I reached my floor, my heart was racing and I was sweating. I calmed down, delivered the shield, and didn't bring it up with anyone. I was sure they'd think I was just paranoid or seeing things. Since then, I've avoided that place. When my supervisor asks me to go to the second basement, I make an excuse. If it's absolutely necessary, I take someone with me. Sometimes the hospital requires me to retrieve something late at night, and I do my best to pass that job to a coworker or ask security to assist. They might think I'm lazy or scared, but they don't push it. I guess everyone in a hospital senses the unnerving atmosphere in certain spots. I can't explain who or what I saw that night. I only know that I saw a man in a white coat with no badge standing there unmoving, and when I reached the end of the hall, he was gone. There was no exit he could have used. The door was locked. That's a fact I can't ignore, and the footsteps I heard were too real to dismiss. My body's reaction was immediate. Chills, tense muscles, sweating. These weren't the result of daydreaming. They happened for a reason. Now, whenever I use the elevator, I avoid pressing B2 unless I have no choice. And if I do go there, it's never alone. My coworkers probably think I'm just being cautious because of construction hazards, but it's more than that. There's something about that floor that makes me uneasy, and it's not just the dust or the stale air. I still do my job. I handle scans, talk to patients, work night shifts. But at the back of my mind, I'll always remember that corridor, that white coat and the locked door. It's a reminder that hospitals can feel eerie in ways people don't always talk about. I've stopped trying to rationalize it too much. I know what I saw, and I know how it made me feel. That's enough for me to stay away, especially when I'm alone. If someone asks why, I just shrug and say, it's under construction, and let them assume what they want. I can handle a lot in this job: blood, emergencies, stressed out patients. But the second basement at night is a different kind of stress. It's not the typical hospital hustle or the usual sounds of machines and monitors. It's a quiet, uncomfortable space where I once saw something that shouldn't have been there. Something that disappeared in an impossible way. Something I can't fully explain. And because of that, I avoid it at all costs.